Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I'm 25 years old, originally from Australia, and last summer I joined a wildlife photography expedition to Yosemite National Park. Our group consisted of 5 photographers, all eager to capture the raw beauty of California's wilderness. The vastness of Yosemite is breathtaking, spanning over 700,000 acres of untamed land. We arrived at the visitor center early morning, where we met Mike, our experienced guide. He briefed us about the local wildlife and safety protocols. The morning light was perfect for photography, illuminating the towering cliffs and ancient sequoias. I remember asking Mike about mountain lion sightings in the area. He mentioned there were only about 20 confirmed cats in this massive park. Being the overconfident photographer I was, I thought those were pretty good odds. I noticed some hikers carrying bear spray at the visitor center, $40 a can. Like the cocky idiot I was, I thought, no way I'm wasting money on that. Our group headed out on the trail, with Mike leading the way. After a few hours, we reached a stunning viewpoint overlooking the valley. The rest of the group wanted to stay there for sunset shots, but I spotted a particularly interesting rock formation about a mile away. Despite Mike's warnings about solo hiking, I decided to break away from the group. The vegetation was dense, especially challenging for someone 5'8" like myself. The summer heat was intense, and sweat kept fogging up my camera lens. After about 40 minutes of walking through the brush, I finally reached the base of the formation. As I started climbing higher, a cool breeze picked up, offering some relief from the heat. I'm certain I saw a tarantula on my way up. It quickly retreated into its burrow when I got close. Spiders aren't my favorite, but I pressed on. Once I gained some elevation, I planned a horseshoe route along the ridge to reach the peak. It shouldn't take more than an hour, I thought. At the summit, I set up my camera to scout for wildlife, but the landscape was eerily empty. The solitude was both peaceful and unsettling. Looking for my return route, I could see our meeting point about 2 miles away. At the base of the formation was a natural drainage that led right back to the main trail. Rather than fight through the thick brush again, I decided to descend the steep face and follow the drainage back. I remembered the ranger's advice about making noise to alert predators of human presence. Not having a bell, because who wants to sound like a walking Christmas decoration? I started humming and occasionally calling out. I'd been walking down the drainage for about 20 minutes when I heard rustling in the brush. I froze and everything went silent. About a minute later, as I cautiously moved forward, I saw a massive mountain lion burst out of the bushes, moving upslope while snarling. It got about 200 feet away, turned, and stared directly at me. My hands trembling, I managed to snap a quick photo. Nobody would believe this otherwise. Common sense finally kicked in, along with an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. I was in a standoff with one of North America's deadliest predators, alone, with no cell service. Keeping my eyes on the cat, I began moving sideways along the drainage. That's when it started paralleling my movement from the high ground. After a few minutes, it changed course, now walking straight toward me. I knew it was already within the danger zone. Rangers had repeatedly warned us about keeping at least 300 feet of distance. When it was about 150 feet away, I started shouting with my hands above my head, trying to appear larger and more intimidating. The mountain lion couldn't have cared less. It kept advancing, then let out a bone-chilling roar and charged down the slope. Time seemed to freeze. I recalled all the wildlife safety advice. With mountain lions, you're supposed to stand your ground and appear large. But this cat had already seen me, stalked me, and was now charging. This wasn't a bluff. Reality hit hard. I was alone in the wilderness, no cell service, about to become prey. As the cat charged down, I had mere seconds when it would briefly disappear behind some rocks. The terrain was steep. I was on the west side of the drainage, which was about 15 feet wide and ankle deep. The bank behind me was about 60 feet high, and on the mountain lion's side was a steep slope it was charging down from. Dense vegetation partially obscured its approach. When it reached the upper bank and disappeared behind the foliage, I turned and scrambled up the opposite bank, using roots and rocks as handholds. I pulled myself over the top, got to my feet, and started sprinting. I knew I couldn't outrun a mountain lion. They can reach speeds over 40 miles per hour. But I hoped to get within shouting distance of the trail before it caught me. Adrenaline surged through my body, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. My mind raced with terrible thoughts. This is it. I'm 25 and about to die in the most horrific way possible. After running about 1,000 feet, I heard another roar. Glancing back, I saw the mountain lion had crossed the drainage and climbed the bank. It stood on its hind legs, nose in the air, right where I'd been moments before. I kept running while filming a goodbye video on my phone for my parents, thinking they might at least find the device after the cat was done with me. Every second, I expected to hear the thunder of paws behind me, preparing myself to hit the ground and curl up. Despite being fit, running with camera gear on uneven terrain was exhausting. I crashed through bushes at full speed, knowing it was just a matter of time before I tripped and broke something. After what felt like an eternity, I finally spotted the trail. The shift from soft ground to hard-packed dirt sent shooting pain through my ankle. But I didn't slow down until I reached the ranger station. The ranger immediately grabbed his binoculars and confirmed he could see the mountain lion, still several hundred yards from the trail. While filling out the incident report, one question stood out. What was the animal's demeanor? I had to laugh at the formality of it all. I'd never experienced that certain death feeling before, being absolutely convinced that in just a few moments, it would all be over, and in such a horrific way. For months afterward, I had nightmares about what could have happened. The phrase mountain lion attack doesn't do justice to what these creatures are capable of. We're talking about a 200-pound killing machine, with claws that can shred skin like paper and jaws powerful enough to crush bones. And all the while, they're programmed to go for your face and throat. A few weeks later, I read about a hiker in the same area who wasn't as lucky as me. That could have been my story. Looking back, I know I was foolish to hike alone, but in a way, I'm grateful it was just me. If I'd been with someone slower, There's no way I could have left them behind. Different circumstances, different ending. I was on my first solo backpacking trip in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. My plan was to hike Mount Hamilton, spending the night near the summit before completing the trek the next day. If you haven't been there, the trail is absolutely stunning. It winds through ancient pine forests before ascending to a rocky ridge that offers spectacular views of the surrounding wilderness. About 3 miles into my ascent, a hiker overtook me on the trail. Instead of the usual friendly nod and passing, he slowed to match my pace and started talking. Nothing specific about our conversation raised red flags, but something about him felt deeply wrong. His enthusiasm seemed artificial, almost manic. You know those interviews with cult leaders, where their charisma feels forced and unsettling. He had that same kind of energy. He kept talking about how he loved pushing himself to extremes, but nothing felt challenging anymore. The way he spoke made my skin crawl, like someone trying to imitate human excitement, without quite understanding how it should sound. His eyes never seemed to blink, and his smile never quite reached them. The vibes were seriously freaking me out, so I made an excuse to stop for lunch. He continued up the trail, and I thought that would be the end of our strange encounter. The rest of my day was beautiful, and as I hiked, the memory of him began to fade. I found an incredible campsite on a rocky ledge overlooking the valley and settled in for the night. As darkness fell, the usual backcountry anxieties crept in. The memory of that strange hiker kept surfacing in my mind, even though I was just cowboy camping under the stars. I made sure to place my fixed blade knife within easy reach before going to sleep. I eventually drifted off while listening to history podcasts on my phone. I slept unusually soundly until morning, which was strange for my first night alone in the wilderness. That sense of peace shattered when I went to grab my stove from my backpack. The location of my pack wasn't the issue. It was still leaning against the pine tree about 5 feet from where I'd slept. What made my blood run cold was seeing every single pocket open. All the zippers were undone. Every snap closure was unfastened. The sleeping bag compartment gaped open. The interior mesh pockets were all unzipped. Even the buckle closures on my stuff sacks inside the bag were undone. Nothing was missing, and the pack hadn't been moved, but every single compartment had been methodically opened. In a panic, I looked down at where my knife lay beside my sleeping pad. Sure enough, the snap closure that secured it to its sheath had been undone. I've never packed up camp so quickly in my life. The entire time, I kept imagining him standing there in the darkness, systematically going through my belongings while I slept just feet away. Later, in the nearest town, I met some local hikers who knew about this guy. Apparently, he had a history of following solo hikers and going through their gear while they slept. He never stole anything. He just wanted them to know he could have. The authorities had been trying to catch him for months, but the vastness of the wilderness made it nearly impossible to track him down. I still go hiking alone, but that experience changed how I approach backcountry camping. Now I always set up my tent, even on clear nights, and I'm much more careful about where I choose to camp. Sometimes the most unsettling threats aren't the wildlife or the elements. They're the other humans who venture into these remote places. carrying their own dark intentions into the wilderness. I never considered myself superstitious, but a hiking experience in the Scottish Highlands challenged everything I believed about the rational world. Last autumn, our group of 4 experienced hikers planned to stay at a remote mountain refuge, locally known as a bothy. For those unfamiliar, bothies are basic shelters scattered throughout the highlands, abandoned farmhouses, or shepherd huts maintained for hikers to use freely. We found ourselves at Raven's Rest, a 2-story stone structure built in the early 1800s. The building stood alone against the backdrop of mist-covered mountains, its weathered walls seemingly holding centuries of stories. What made this bothy particularly isolated was its location. A good 4 hours trek from the nearest paved road, with no cell service or signs of civilization. The evening started perfectly. The weather was typically Scottish, a fine drizzle and bitter wind that made the warmth of our fire even more welcoming. The old stone fireplace crackled with burning wood, casting dancing shadows on walls that had sheltered travelers for over 200 years. We spent the evening sharing hiking stories and playing cards, our laughter echoing through the empty rooms. The bothy had 2 rooms downstairs, a main room with a fireplace and a smaller storage area, and a simple sleeping loft upstairs accessible by worn wooden stairs. The floorboards were original, each step accompanied by the gentle creaking of aged timber. We had the place to ourselves, or at least we thought we did. Around 3 in the morning, I woke suddenly. You know that feeling when something isn't right? Not fear exactly, but a deep, instinctive unease. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow across the room. That's when I heard it, the distinct sound of the heavy wooden front door creaking open, followed by deliberate footsteps on the old floorboards. These weren't the rushed steps of someone seeking shelter from the rain. They were slow, purposeful footsteps that crossed the main room with an unnatural steadiness. The sound of boots on wood echoed through the building, each step perfectly spaced, as if someone was pacing with calculated precision. My 3 companions were now awake too, eyes wide in the darkness. The footsteps continued for maybe 2 minutes, though it felt much longer. Then came the sound that still haunts me, the heavy front door slamming shut with such force that the entire building seemed to shudder. What followed was absolute silence, but not the natural quiet of a Highland night. This was a thick, oppressive silence that seemed to press against our ears. After what felt like an eternity, we gathered enough courage to check downstairs. The wood in the fireplace still glowed softly, providing just enough light to see that the room was empty. The door was firmly closed, showing no signs of having been opened. What struck us most was the complete absence of footprints in the thick layer of mud that always accumulated near the door. And in the Scottish Highlands, there's always mud. We huddled in the main room until dawn, none of us willing to return upstairs. As the first gray light filtered through the windows, an elderly hiker arrived for breakfast. When we mentioned our experience, his weathered face grew serious. He explained that Raven's Rest was well known among Highland hikers for strange occurrences. Many visitors reported hearing footsteps when no one was around, or feeling watched by unseen eyes. The history he shared was darker than we expected. In the winter of 1872, a shepherd had died here during a particularly brutal storm. Legend has it he still walks his rounds every night, checking the building as he did in life. The old hiker admitted he'd heard the footsteps himself on 2 separate occasions, always around 3 in the morning, always with the same deliberate pace. I've spent countless nights in remote places, mountain peaks, desert canyons, dense forests, but nothing compares to that night in the highlands. There was something different about those footsteps, something that didn't belong to our world of Gore-Tex and GPS coordinates. They carried the weight of history, the echo of centuries past. The rational part of my mind still searches for explanations. Old buildings settle, wind plays tricks. Imagination runs wild in the dark. But another part of me knows what we heard that night was real. Some places hold onto pieces of the past, and sometimes, in the dark hours of a highland night, those pieces still walk their ancient paths. I've returned to the highlands many times since then, but I've never stayed at Raven's Rest again. Some stories are better left untold, some paths better left untraveled. But on stormy nights, when the wind howls just right, I sometimes think about that old stone bothy, standing alone in the highland mist, and wonder who might be walking its floors at 3 in the morning. During a late autumn camping trip in the Olympic National Forest, my younger sister and I begged our parents to let us sleep in our new tent instead of the family's cozy motorhome. The forest was particularly beautiful that time of year, tall Douglas firs swaying gently in the breeze, their branches creating intricate shadows in the moonlight. Our campsite was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by ancient trees and thick underbrush. The weather was perfect for camping crisp, but not too cold, with a clear sky full of stars. We set up our little blue tent about 20 feet from the motorhome, feeling adventurous and grown-up. Our father helped us lay down a tarp first, ensuring we wouldn't get damp from the ground. We arranged our sleeping bags and pillows perfectly, added our favorite stuffed animals, and felt totally prepared for our outdoor adventure. Everything was fine until about midnight. The forest had settled into its nighttime rhythm, the soft hooting of owls, the rustle of wind through the trees, and the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. Then we heard it, a strange scratching sound against the tent wall. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the night, it seemed to fill our entire world. At first, we tried to convince ourselves it was just a branch brushing against the tent. But the sound was too regular, too persistent. It would stop for a few minutes, then start again, always in different spots around the tent. Sometimes it sounded like something was gently running its fingers along the fabric. Other times like something was testing the material's strength. My sister, who was 11 at the time, grabbed my hand in the darkness. I could feel her trembling. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, then realized she couldn't see me in the dark. "Yeah," I whispered back, trying to sound braver than I felt. We both lay there, absolutely still, listening to whatever was circling our tent. The scratching continued, moving from one side to the other, sometimes accompanied by a soft, rustling sound. Our imaginations ran wild. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? Or something even worse? Every horror story we'd ever heard came flooding back, each more terrifying than the last. Finally, we couldn't take it anymore. We called out to our parents, our voices shaking. The sound of the motorhome door opening never seemed so welcoming. Our father came out with a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. He walked around our tent, checking every angle, but found nothing immediately threatening. He convinced us to try sleeping again, saying it was probably just the wind or small animals. We agreed, mostly because we didn't want to seem like cowards. But not 15 minutes after he returned to the motorhome, the sounds started again. This time they seemed even closer, more deliberate. That was it. We grabbed our sleeping bags and ran for the motorhome, not even bothering to zip up the tent. We spent the rest of the night safely tucked in the motorhome's built-in bunks, listening to the familiar sound of our parents' breathing instead of mysterious scratching. The next morning, our father went to take down the tent, and that's when we discovered the truth. Several field mice had built an elaborate network of tunnels right under our tent, their movement causing the fabric to brush against our air mattresses. The tarp we'd laid down had created a perfect shelter for them, and they'd spent the night establishing their new home. What had seemed terrifying in the darkness turned out to be completely harmless in the light of day. Those mysterious scratching sounds were just tiny paws moving through their underground highways, and the rustling was them gathering materials for their nests. We learned an important lesson that night. Sometimes the scariest things have the simplest explanations. The incident became a family joke, brought up at every camping trip afterward. Now, years later, whenever we go camping and hear strange noises in the night, we always joke about our mouse hotel experience. But I have to admit, even knowing the truth, there's still something eerie about lying in a tent in the darkness, listening to unexplained sounds in the wilderness. Maybe it's not the sounds themselves that frighten us, but the stories our minds create to explain them. This happened during a family camping trip in the Cascade Mountains when I was 12 years old. It was late August, and the forest had been unusually dry that summer. We were camping in our vintage Westphalia van at a remote site, surrounded by towering Douglas firs and western red cedars that seemed to touch the sky. I woke up unusually early that morning, sometime around 5. The air felt different, thicker somehow, with an acrid taste I couldn't quite place. Through the van's window, I noticed a strange orange glow painting the treetops. At first, my sleepy mind thought it was just an exceptionally beautiful sunrise, but something felt wrong. My brother James, who was 14 and had earned every possible wilderness badge in his scout troop, took one look at the sky, and his face went pale. "That's not the sun," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. "That's a forest fire." Our father had always drilled us on emergency protocols, but nothing prepares you for the real thing. We woke our parents, and the change in atmosphere was immediate. Mom started packing our sleeping bags, while Dad ran outside to check the situation. When he came back, his expression told us everything we needed to know. We packed up camp in record time. No folding, no organizing, just shoving everything into the van as quickly as possible. The orange glow was getting brighter, and now we could see smoke starting to drift between the trees. The morning birds had gone silent, replaced by an eerie stillness that made everything feel surreal. Dad got behind the wheel of our old Westphalia, a 1976 classic, that had never faced a challenge like this. The narrow mountain road was barely wide enough for two vehicles, with sharp drop-offs on one side and steep rock faces on the other. No guardrails, just wilderness and gravity. As we drove, the smoke got thicker, making it harder to see the road. Dad kept telling us everything would be fine, but his white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel told a different story. The van's engine strained against the mountain grades, each curve bringing us either closer to safety or disaster. We couldn't tell which. We hadn't been driving long when we saw the flashing lights of a Forest Service truck coming out of a side road. The ranger flagged us down, and my heart nearly stopped. But his news was surprisingly reassuring. We were heading in the right direction, and while the fire was moving fast, we had enough time to get out safely if we kept moving. That should have made us feel better, but as soon as we started driving again, Dad pressed the accelerator harder than before. The smoke was getting thicker, and through the trees, we could occasionally see actual flames in the distance. The heat was noticeable even inside the van, and the normally cool mountain air had become stifling. I remember looking back through the rear window, watching the orange glow get brighter and brighter. The smoke had turned the morning sky into an apocalyptic landscape of reds and blacks. The fire seemed alive, like some ancient monster awakening from the earth itself, consuming everything in its path. The descent felt like it took hours, though it was probably only 45 minutes. Every curve brought new challenges: smoke, reducing visibility, wildlife darting across the road trying to escape the flames, and the constant worry that our old van might not handle the strain. When we finally reached the main highway, the relief was overwhelming. Looking back at the mountains, we could see the massive cloud of smoke rising into the sky, turning day into night. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles were rushing past us, heading toward the inferno we just escaped. That experience changed how I see wildfires forever. Whenever I watch news coverage of forest fires now, I remember that morning, the surreal orange glow, the acrid taste of smoke, the absolute silence of a forest preparing to burn, and the primal fear of being trapped by an advancing wall of flames. Years later, I learned that the fire had started from a lightning strike and eventually burned over 50,000 acres. We were among the lucky ones who got out early. Some people had to be evacuated by helicopter when the roads became impassable. The most lasting impact wasn't the terror of escape, or even the impressive display of nature's power. It was the realization of how quickly things can change, how a peaceful family camping trip can transform into a race for survival in the span of a single sunrise. Last summer, during a weekend camping trip with my girlfriend, I made a mistake that still haunts me. Being relatively new to camping together, I wanted to make her feel comfortable. So I booked a spot at Pine Grove Campground, a semi-developed site where you could still see neighboring campers through the trees. Not too remote, but far enough from the city to feel like a proper escape. We arrived in late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to soften, casting long shadows through the pines. The air was crisp with the scent of timber and wild mint, and the distant sound of a creek added to the peaceful atmosphere. We quickly set up our site, arranging our tent and creating a cozy outdoor living space. As evening settled in, we were sitting around our campfire, enjoying some wine and grilled vegetables, when an old pickup truck pulled into the neighboring site. A man got out alone and started setting up his camp. He seemed to struggle with his tent poles, and after a few minutes, he walked over to ask if he could borrow a mallet for his stakes. The man appeared to be in his late 30s, quiet and reserved in a way that initially seemed polite rather than concerning. We lent him our tools, and seeing him camping alone, invited him to join us by the fire later if he wanted some company. He smiled softly and nodded, then returned to his site. When he came back later to return the mallet, he lingered. We tried including him in conversation, but he remained oddly quiet, content to just observe us talking. There was something unsettling about his presence. Not anything he did specifically, but the way he watched us, like he was studying our behavior rather than participating in it. As the night wore on, my girlfriend mentioned she was tired and headed to our tent. I stayed up a bit longer, making awkward small talk with our neighbor before finally saying goodnight. That's when things got strange. Instead of returning to his site, he got into his truck and just sat there with the engine running. I tried to ignore it as I got ready for bed, but the sound of his idling engine continued for hours. Eventually, I fell into an uneasy sleep, only to wake up in the pre-dawn hours, needing to use the bathroom. When I peered out of the tent, his truck was still running, the soft rumble of the engine cutting through the night's silence. I managed to fall asleep again, but when we woke up with the sunrise, something was wrong. His tent was still there, but his truck was gone. More disturbing was the fact that our car door was standing wide open. We rushed to check. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed, but the door had definitely been closed and locked the night before. The whole experience left us deeply unsettled. We packed up quickly and left, unable to shake the feeling that something worse could have happened. The rangers later told us they had no record of anyone reserving that site for the night, and no one had paid the walk-in fee either. My girlfriend and I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just an insomniac. Maybe he had anxiety about sleeping outdoors. Maybe the car door was our own careless mistake. But we both knew something wasn't right. The way he watched us, the hours spent idling in his truck, the mysteriously opened car door. It all pointed to something more sinister. Looking back, we realized how many warning signs we ignored. His unusual quietness wasn't shyness, it was calculation. His prolonged observation wasn't social awkwardness, it was predatory. He had invited a stranger into our space, assuming the best about him simply because we were in a safe campground. Now when we go camping, we're much more cautious about neighboring campers. We've learned that the wilderness isn't always the most dangerous thing out there. Sometimes it's the people who seek out isolated places with unknown intentions. That night taught us that trust should be earned, not freely given, even in places where everyone is supposed to be united by their love of the outdoors. The most chilling part. A month later, we read about several break-ins at the same campground, all following a similar pattern. A quiet, solitary camper who would make small talk with his neighbors before robbing their sites in the middle of the night. We never found out if it was the same person, but the description was eerily familiar. During a late October camping trip in the Green Mountains of Vermont, my family decided to test out our new four-season tent. The autumn colors were at their peak, with maple and birch trees creating a canopy of red and gold above our campsite. The weather forecast promised clear skies, but there was already a distinct chill in the air that hinted at the approaching winter. Our campsite was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by old-growth forest. The ground was carpeted with fallen leaves, creating a natural cushion beneath our feet. We carefully selected a spot that looked level and clear of roots or rocks, laying down our footprint before setting up the tent. The new tent was impressive, a sturdy dome design with reinforced poles and weather-resistant fabric that promised to keep us warm and dry. My 13-year-old daughter Amanda and I decided to sleep in the tent, while my wife chose to stay in our small camping trailer, claiming she needed better back support. We arranged our sleeping bags on premium insulated pads, added extra blankets for warmth, and even brought our favorite pillows to make it feel more like home. The evening started peacefully enough. We roasted marshmallows, told stories around the campfire, and watched the stars emerge in the crystal-clear mountain sky. Around 10 o'clock, Amanda and I retired to our tent, excited about our little adventure. The temperature had dropped significantly, but our sleeping bags were rated for winter use, and the tent felt surprisingly cozy. We had been asleep for a few hours when the first strange sound woke us. It was a soft scratching noise, barely audible, but definitely coming from beneath the tent floor. At first, we dismissed it as fallen leaves rustling in the wind, but there was something oddly rhythmic about it, almost purposeful. The scratching would stop for a few minutes, then start again in a different spot. Sometimes it sounded like something was gently running along the bottom of the tent. Other times like something was testing the fabric's resistance. Amanda pressed closer to me, her voice trembling slightly as she whispered, "Dad, what's making that noise?" I tried to sound confident as I explained it was probably just some small animal, but the sounds continued to move around the tent's perimeter. We could hear what seemed like multiple creatures moving beneath us, their movements creating an unsettling symphony in the darkness. After about an hour of this nerve-wracking concert, we both started feeling movement through our sleeping pads. It was subtle at first, just slight disturbances in the ground beneath us, but it gradually became more noticeable. It felt as if the earth itself was shifting under our tent. That was the breaking point for Amanda. She grabbed her flashlight and sleeping bag, declaring she was joining her mother in the trailer. I had to admit, the mysterious movements had me spooked too, so I followed her lead. We spent the rest of the night in the relative safety of our trailer, listening to the wind in the trees instead of unknown creatures beneath our tent. The next morning, armed with daylight and curiosity, I began dismantling the tent to investigate. What we discovered was both fascinating and slightly unsettling. A family of voles small, mouse-like creatures had constructed an elaborate network of tunnels directly beneath where we had pitched our tent. The footprint we had laid down had created an ideal shelter for them, and they had spent the night expanding their underground highway system. The soft ground, already loosened by their existing tunnels, had allowed them to dig more passages throughout the night, causing the movement we had felt through our sleeping pads. What had seemed terrifying in the darkness turned out to be nothing more than an industrious family of rodents taking advantage of our inadvertent roof. My wife found the whole situation hilarious, especially since she had opted for the trailer and avoided the whole ordeal. Amanda, once over her initial fear, became fascinated by the tunnel system and spent the morning carefully documenting it with her camera. She even named the Vole family the Midnight Engineers. The experience taught us two valuable lessons about camping. First, always check the ground thoroughly before setting up your tent, looking for more than just rocks and roots. Second, sometimes the most frightening nighttime mysteries have surprisingly mundane explanations in the light of day. Now, whenever we go camping and hear mysterious sounds in the night, we joke about our underground neighbors and their construction projects. But I have to admit, even knowing the truth, there's still something eerie about lying in a tent in the darkness, listening to unseen creatures tunneling beneath you. The most terrifying night of my life happened during a camping trip in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. The forecast had mentioned a chance of severe thunderstorms, but being an experienced backpacker, I wasn't particularly concerned. However, what meteorologists call a derecho, a massive, fast-moving line of thunderstorms, was about to give me a night I'll never forget. For those unfamiliar with a derecho, imagine a wall of wind so powerful it can snap 100-year-old trees like toothpicks and push small buildings off their foundations. The park rangers had warned about increasing wind speeds, but by then I was already deep in the wilderness, setting up camp for the night. I'd found what seemed like a perfect spot, a small wooden shelter meant for hikers to take refuge during bad weather. It was basically a three-sided structure with a solid roof, offering protection while still allowing you to feel connected to nature. As the sky began to darken ominously, I quickly set up my sleeping bag inside the shelter, feeling thankful for the sturdy roof above my head. The storm hit with shocking intensity. The wind howled through the trees, creating an otherworldly symphony of creaking wood and rustling leaves. Lightning illuminated the forest in stark, brilliant flashes, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. But the storm wasn't going to be my only challenge that night. In the midst of this chaos, I heard heavy footsteps approaching the shelter. Through the next lightning flash, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A massive black bear, easily weighing 400 pounds, was seeking refuge from the storm in the very same shelter. The bear was clearly agitated by the storm, huffing and puffing as it paced around the entrance. Under normal circumstances, black bears usually run away when confronted by humans. But this wasn't normal. The bear was scared, and scared animals are unpredictable. It wasn't happy about sharing the shelter, but the ferocity of the storm left it with few options. Now I found myself in an impossible situation. The bear began circling the shelter, occasionally charging halfway in before retreating, clearly distressed by both the storm and my presence. Its claws made a distinctive clicking sound against the wooden floor with each step, a sound that still haunts my dreams. The lightning continued to strobe, creating a terrifying stop-motion effect of the bear's movements. I tried everything I knew about bear encounters. I made myself look big, shouted authoritatively, even tried using my emergency whistle. Nothing worked. The storm had this bear too frightened to leave the relative safety of the shelter, regardless of my presence. It continued its agitated pacing, occasionally letting out frustrated huffs and growls that were barely audible over the howling wind. Hours passed like this, me pressed against the back wall of the shelter, the bear alternating between pacing and making short charges inward, all while the storm raged around us. I had my hunting knife duct taped to my hand, knowing it would be useless against a full-grown bear, but needing some sense of security. The bear's behavior became increasingly erratic as the storm intensified. It would leave the shelter briefly when the wind died down, only to come charging back in when another thunderclap boomed overhead. Each time it returned, it seemed to come a little closer to where I was huddled. I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to leave because of the lethal storm, yet faced with an increasingly agitated predator. What made it worse was watching the bear's eyes catch the lightning flashes. In those brief moments of illumination, I could see the wild panic in its gaze. This wasn't a predator looking for prey. This was a terrified animal acting on pure instinct, which somehow made it even more dangerous. The storm raged on for what felt like eternity. Around 3 a.m, a particularly violent gust of wind brought down a large tree nearby with a thunderous crash. The bear, already on edge, bolted from the shelter into the storm, disappearing into the darkness. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, its fear of the storm finally overcoming its need for shelter. When morning finally came, I was still shaking. The forest looked like a war zone, trees down everywhere, branches scattered like pickup sticks. I packed up quickly and hiked out, my nerves shot from the sleepless night. The rangers later told me that the derecho had produced winds over 90 miles per hour and caused extensive damage throughout the park. Looking back, I realize how incredibly lucky I was. The bear could have easily decided I was a threat and attacked, or the storm could have brought that shelter down around us. Instead, I got a front row seat to one of nature's most intense displays of raw power and animal behavior. The experience changed how I approach backcountry camping. I'm much more careful about checking weather forecasts now, and I always have a backup plan for severe weather. But most importantly, it reminded me that in the wilderness, we're not always at the top of the food chain. And sometimes the best we can do is wait out the storm and hope for the best. I just returned from a 2-week kayaking expedition down the Snake River with my friend Marcus. The trip was meant to be an adventure of a lifetime, exploring the remote wilderness of Idaho. But our final night turned into something straight out of a nightmare. This experience has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about outdoor survival. The Snake River winds through some of the most isolated terrain in the Northwest, cutting deep canyons through pristine wilderness. For nearly 2 weeks, we had been navigating its waters, camping on sandbars and hidden beaches, living the kind of adventure most people only dream about. The isolation was complete, no cell service, no other travelers, just us and the wild river. That last night, we found what seemed like the perfect campsite, a wide, sandy beach backed by towering cliffs. The river curved gently around our position, providing a stunning view both upstream and down. We had spent the day paddling through some challenging rapids, and both of us were exhausted but satisfied with our progress. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up needing to relieve myself. Marcus was sound asleep in his tent, his soft snoring barely audible over the river's constant flow. The night was cool, but not cold, with a quarter moon providing just enough light to navigate without a flashlight. I walked a short distance from our camp toward the river's edge, trying to stay within sight of our tents while still maintaining privacy. As I stood there, I heard a sharp crack from the brush behind me. My first thought was deer. We'd seen plenty of them along the river. But then I heard it again, louder this time, more deliberate. Every survival instinct suddenly went on high alert. I slowly turned around, and that's when I saw it, a mountain lion, massive and muscular, standing at the edge of our campsite. I froze midstream, literally. My heart stopped, my breath caught in my throat, and my body locked up completely. The cat was enormous, its muscles rippling under fur the color of desert sand. Those eyes, those piercing yellow-green eyes, were locked onto me with an intensity that made me feel like I was already dead. I'd read about mountain lion encounters before. All the advice says to make yourself look big, make noise, stand your ground. But theory and practice are very different things when you're face to face with North America's apex predator. The lion was maybe 25 feet away, its body low to the ground, tail twitching slightly, classic stalking behavior. We held this terrible eye contact for what felt like eternity. My mind was racing through options, none of them good. The river was behind me, our tents 30 feet to my left, and the cat was blocking any safe retreat. I couldn't even call out to Marcus, without risk of triggering an attack. The mountain lion shifted slightly, and I saw its muscles coil, that moment when you know something terrible is about to happen. Then unexpectedly, it turned away. Just like that, as if it had decided I wasn't worth the trouble. It slipped back into the darkness, as silently as it had appeared. My relief was short-lived. I made my way back to my tent as quickly and quietly as possible, my heart thundering in my chest. I woke Marcus to tell him what happened, but he was groggy and skeptical. "Lions are super rare around here," he mumbled, half asleep. "You probably just saw a bobcat." I knew what I'd seen, but I let him talk me down. We were both exhausted, and maybe my eyes had played tricks on me in the moonlight. That's what I wanted to believe, anyway. I tried to sleep, but every sound outside the tent had me on edge. Then it happened again. I heard movement, closer this time. The unmistakable sound of something large moving deliberately through our campsite. I pressed my ear against the tent wall and heard it, the soft pad of large paws on sand, moving slowly, methodically. I peered out through the mesh window and saw it again. The mountain lion was back, this time only 2 feet from our tent, moving slowly past us in the moonlight. I could make out every detail of its muscular form through the screen. My heart was in my throat as I watched it pause, sniff the air, and continue its silent patrol around our campsite. Immediately, I started yelling, grabbed our paddles, ready to defend ourselves if needed. Marcus was instantly awake this time, and we both knew this was no false alarm. We quickly broke camp, packed our gear in record time, and launched our kayaks into the pre-dawn darkness. We paddled furiously downriver, not stopping until we found the next campsite with other people. Later, talking to a park ranger, we learned that this particular stretch of the Snake River was known for its mountain lion activity. If it was stalking you, the ranger said, you wouldn't have seen it twice. Sounds like it was just patrolling its territory, but you made the right call getting out of there. That night changed how I view wilderness camping forever. It's one thing to know intellectually that you're sharing space with predators. It's another thing entirely to lock eyes with one in the dark. The experience taught me that sometimes the best survival strategy is knowing when to walk away. Or in our case, paddle away as fast as possible. Months later, I still get chills thinking about those yellow-green eyes watching me in the darkness. The wilderness is beautiful, but it demands respect. Sometimes it reminds us, in the most visceral way possible, that we're not always at the top of the food chain. I've been an avid backpacker for over a decade, but what happened during a solo trip in the Adirondack Mountains last October still makes me question everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. I'm sharing this story because I need to know if anyone else has experienced something similar in these ancient mountains. The Adirondacks in autumn are hauntingly beautiful sugar maples, blazing with color, pristine lakes reflecting the sky like mirrors, and miles of remote trails winding through old-growth forest. I had found a particularly isolated spot about 4 miles off the main trail, the kind of place where you can truly feel alone with nature. The day had been perfect for hiking crisp autumn air, clear skies, and that special kind of silence you only find in deep woods. I set up my camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering hemlocks and ancient birch trees. As night fell, I had a small fire going, creating that perfect circle of warmth and light against the gathering darkness. Around 2 in the morning, I woke suddenly, not from a noise, but from a feeling, that instinctive sense that something isn't right. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow across the clearing. The autumn air was completely still, creating an unnatural silence that seemed to press against my ears. That's when I heard it, a distinct knocking sound coming from the forest. 2 solid knocks, then silence, like someone striking 2 thick branches together, but with a deliberate rhythm that no natural forest sound would make. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a falling branch, or some kind of woodpecker that was active at night. Then it came again, knock, knock, this time from a different direction, but with the same rhythm, the same deliberate quality. The sound seemed to be moving, circling my campsite. I sat perfectly still, straining my ears in the darkness. The knocking continued, coming from different points around the clearing, always maintaining that same measured pace. After the 3rd series of knocks, I noticed something else. Between each set, there was exactly the same amount of time, as if whatever was making the sound was following a precise pattern. This wasn't random. This wasn't natural. This was communication. My mind started racing through possibilities. I'd heard stories about wood knocking, supposedly a way that undiscovered primates communicate in the wilderness. I'd always dismissed these tales as campfire stories, but sitting there in the darkness, listening to those methodical knocks circling my camp, I wasn't so sure anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, scanning the tree line. The beam seemed pathetically weak against the wall of darkness beyond my camp. Each time I pointed the light toward a knock, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. But the knocking continued, maintaining its steady rhythm, moving through the forest with purpose. As the night wore on, the pattern changed. The knocks started coming closer together, the pauses between them shorter. It felt like whatever was out there was trying to create a sense of urgency, or maybe building up to something. The sound was definitely closer now, just at the edge of my clearing. Around 4 in the morning, everything changed. The knocking suddenly stopped, replaced by an absolute silence that was somehow even more terrifying. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush, circling my camp just as the knocks had done. These weren't the light steps of a deer, or even the heavy plod of a black bear. These were deliberate, bipedal footsteps, something walking on 2 legs, moving with purpose through the forest. I could hear branches snapping, leaves crunching, and occasionally, a deep, resonant sound that was almost like breathing. But unlike anything I'd ever heard from a human or animal. I spent the rest of the night in my tent, knife in hand, listening to whatever it was patrol the perimeter of my camp. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the footsteps finally receded into the forest. The morning revealed nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign at all of what had spent the night circling my camp. When I hiked out later that day, I spoke with a local ranger about what had happened. I expected skepticism, but instead he grew serious and asked me to mark the location on his map. He mentioned that there had been similar reports from that area over the years. Always the same pattern of knocking, always at night, always in the deepest parts of the forest. The ranger wouldn't elaborate further, but he did say something that still haunts me. The Adirondacks are ancient mountains, and they keep their secrets well. Sometimes it's better not to know what's out there in the dark. I've continued backpacking since then, but I've never returned to that particular area. Sometimes, on quiet nights in the wilderness, I find myself listening for that distinctive knocking sound. Part of me hopes I'll never hear it again, but another part wonders what was trying to communicate with me that night in the ancient Adirondack forest. I'm not saying I encountered something supernatural or unexplainable. Maybe there's a perfectly logical explanation for what happened. But I do know this. There are things in the wilderness that defy our understanding. Things that remind us that despite all our technology and knowledge, we still don't fully comprehend the mysteries that lurk in the dark corners of our world. The Isle of Skye holds many secrets within its misty mountains. But what happened at the old stone lodge last autumn still sends shivers down my spine. I've been hiking the Scottish Highlands for years, staying in various remote mountain shelters, known locally as bothies, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. The lodge, called Raven's Rest by locals, stands alone at the head of a remote valley. Its weathered stone walls a testament to over 2 centuries of highland storms. Built in 1820 as a shepherd's dwelling, it's now maintained as a free shelter for hikers brave enough to venture this far into the wilderness. The nearest road is a grueling 5-hour hike away, and the complete absence of cell service makes it one of the most isolated buildings in Scotland. My group consisted of 4 experienced hikers myself, Thomas, who I'd met on previous Highland expeditions, and a couple, Rachel and David, who were documenting remote bothies for their travel blog. We arrived late afternoon, our boots heavy with mud from the boggy terrain, just as a typical Highland mist began to settle over the valley. The lodge was impressively solid for its age, 2 stories of rough-hewn stone, with thick walls that had weathered countless storms. The main room featured a large fireplace, its blackened stones speaking of centuries of use. Upstairs, wooden floorboards, worn smooth by generations of boots, led to a simple sleeping area under the eaves. We got a fire going in the hearth, its warm light creating an illusion of comfort against the growing darkness outside. The wind picked up as night fell, creating an eerie whistling through the building's ancient stonework. We shared hiking stories over hot tea, our voices competing with the crackling fire and howling wind. Around 3 in the morning, I woke suddenly, though I couldn't say why. The fire had burned low, casting weak shadows across the room. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the heavy wooden door creaking open, followed by deliberate footsteps on the stone floor. These weren't the cautious steps of another hiker seeking shelter. They were purposeful, steady, as if someone was making their routine rounds. The footsteps crossed the main room with unnatural precision, each step exactly spaced, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo through the building's bones. My companions were now awake too, all of us frozen in our sleeping bags, listening to the stranger below. The steps continued for perhaps 2 minutes. Then the door slammed shut with such force that the entire building shuddered. What followed was a silence, so absolute it seemed to press against our ears. After what felt like an eternity, we gathered enough courage to check downstairs. The room was empty, the door firmly closed. Most striking was the complete absence of footprints in the thick layer of dust near the door. And in the Scottish Highlands, there's always dust and mud around bothy doors. Dawn brought an elderly hiker seeking shelter from an approaching storm. When we described our experience, his weathered face grew serious. He explained that Raven's Rest had a long history of similar occurrences. According to local tradition, the lodge's original owner, an old shepherd named Angus MacLeod, had perished here during the Great Storm of 1846. They found him frozen at his post, still clutching the door he'd been trying to secure against the gale. The old hiker shared that over the years, many visitors had reported hearing footsteps at exactly 3 in the morning, the time MacLeod's body was discovered. Some say he still makes his rounds, checking the lodge as he did in life. The hiker himself had experienced the footsteps twice before, always at the same hour, always with the same deliberate pace. What made it more unsettling was learning that our experience fit a pattern documented in the Bothy's logbook. Dozens of entries described identical experiences. Footsteps at 3 a.m., the door slamming, and most eerily, no tracks left behind. The entries span decades, written by people who couldn't possibly have known each other's stories. We spent another night at the lodge, but this time no footsteps disturbed our sleep. In the morning, we found the logbook entry from exactly 50 years ago, a detailed account of our exact experience, down to the precise rhythm of the footsteps and the violent door slam. I've stayed in many Bothies since then, but I've never returned to Raven's Rest. Some places seem to exist in the overlap between our world and something older, something we can't quite understand. The rational part of my mind still searches for logical explanations. Old buildings settle, wind plays tricks. Imagination fills in the gaps. But another part of me knows what we heard that night was real. The Scottish Highlands are ancient lands, where centuries of history layer upon themselves like the peat in the bogs. Sometimes, in remote places like Raven's Rest, that history finds ways to remind us that not all stories end when the storyteller dies. The experience changed how I view these old buildings. They're not just shelters from the Highland, whether they're repositories of countless stories, some of which refuse to fade into history. Now, whenever I stay in a remote bothy, I find myself listening more carefully in those dark hours before dawn, wondering what other tales these ancient walls might have to tell. After 15 years of long-distance hiking, including 2 complete traverses of the Pacific Crest Trail and countless wilderness expeditions, I thought I'd seen everything the backcountry could throw at me. But during my last PCT hike in Oregon's Three Sisters Wilderness, I encountered something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. The Three Sisters section of the PCT is breathtaking ancient volcanic peaks, pristine alpine meadows, and some of the most remote terrain in the Pacific Northwest. I'd covered about 150 miles of challenging terrain, seeing only a handful of other hikers along the way. The isolation was profound, exactly what I was looking for. One afternoon, while taking a break in a meadow called Echo Basin, I noticed something odd. A large buck stood about 30 feet from my resting spot, staring intently in my direction. Instead of the usual cautious behavior I'd expect from deer, this one started approaching me. I shouted and waved my arms, standard procedure for unwanted wildlife encounters. But the deer just circled around, maintaining that unnerving stare. When it finally moved away, I decided to try some fishing in the nearby stream before sunset. The girls I'd been hiking with said they'd finish setting up camp. We were sharing a 3-person ultralight tent, making our base camp efficient and quick to establish. As I passed a massive boulder near the stream, roughly the size of a small cabin, I nearly collided with a young man who seemed to appear from nowhere. He was oddly dressed for the backcountry, wearing clean running shorts and a pristine white t-shirt, carrying only a small day pack. Something felt immediately wrong about his presence. The strange part wasn't just his inappropriate attire or minimal gear. It was the fact that he was walking straight through the meadow, far from any trail, in an area that was at least 2 days' hike from the nearest road. His clothes were spotless, showing no signs of the dirt and wear that inevitably come with backcountry travel. He stopped and asked what I was doing in a flat, emotionless voice. When I mentioned fishing, he followed up with, "What will you do with them?" in the same monotone. His questions seemed scripted, as if he was reading from a manual on human interaction. There was no natural flow to his speech, no normal conversational rhythm. I tried to move toward the stream, but he paralleled my movement, maintaining the same distance between us. When I stopped at a small beach along the water, he squatted down about 20 feet away and just watched. No movement, no expression, just intense observation. After I caught a decent-sized trout, he asked, "How does it taste?" Without any change in his unnaturally flat tone. His face bore a strange smile that never quite reached his eyes. A deep sense of wrongness washed over me, raising the hair on my neck. I mumbled something about needing to clean it first, deliberately leaving my knife stuck in the sand within easy reach. After what felt like an eternity, he announced, "I'm hiking 30 miles today." Given the terrain and his lack of proper gear, this was virtually impossible. I made a non-committal response, hoping he'd leave. He stood up and walked straight into the forest, not following any trail, and disappeared into the thick undergrowth. Back at camp, I didn't mention the encounter to my hiking partners, not wanting to spread anxiety. As night fell, we settled into our tent. Around midnight, both girls sat up suddenly. "There's something out there," one whispered. I tried to dismiss it, but seconds later, we heard fast, shuffling movement outside. I bolted upright and through the tent wall. I could see my sleeping pad moving in the vestibule. Something was physically touching our tent. Heart pounding, I grabbed our bear spray and unzipped the tent, ready to face whatever was out there. But when I looked out, there was nothing. Complete silence. Not even a distant rustle of movement. We tried to sleep, but the disturbances continued throughout the night. 7 or 8 times, we heard that same shuffling approach, felt movement against the tent, only to find nothing when we checked. Each time, the silence that followed was absolute. No retreating footsteps. No sound of vegetation moving, just total stillness. I was exhausted and starting to drift off when I heard the sound again. Looking over, I saw both my companions were asleep. This time, when I opened the tent, there he was, the same man from earlier, on all fours in a push-up position, about 15 feet from our tent. His face bore that same empty smile as he stared directly at me. Then, with impossible speed, he crawled backward into the darkness. I jerked awake, relief flooding through me as I realized it was just a dream. But when I mentioned my nightmare the next morning, one of my hiking partners looked at me strangely. "That wasn't a dream," she said. "We all saw him by the stream yesterday." They remembered seeing him watching me fish, but had no memory of the night's disturbances. They both recalled feeling unusually sleepy that evening, like there was a gap in their memories. We never slept in Echo Basin again. The experience left us with more questions than answers. Who was he? How did he survive out there with minimal gear? Why did he behave so strangely? I've spent thousands of nights in the wilderness, but something about that encounter was fundamentally wrong, as if we'd brushed against something that wasn't meant to be seen. Years later, I still can't explain what happened that night. The logical part of my mind tries to rationalize it. Maybe he was a lost hiker in shock. Maybe there was a road access point I didn't know about. But deep down, I know we encountered something that defied normal explanation. The PCT holds many secrets, and perhaps some of them should remain unexplained. After years of exploring the Canadian Rockies, I've learned that some of the most beautiful places can also be the most dangerous. This particular story takes place at Emerald Lake, a remote body of water nestled deep in the mountains of Alberta. While the lake is stunning, what happened there one autumn night still makes me question my decision to ever camp alone. I'd been traveling in my converted Westphalia van, exploring the lesser-known areas of the park system. After 3 months on the road, covering nearly 3,000 miles of mountain highways and backroads, I developed a good sense for finding secluded camping spots. That evening, I turned off onto a narrow Forest Service road, driving another 40 minutes until I found a perfect spot overlooking the lake. The location was incredible. A small clearing with a direct view of the water, surrounded by towering lodgepole pines and ancient cedars. As the sun set, the lake's surface turned to liquid gold, reflecting the surrounding peaks in perfect mirror image. I felt that familiar sense of peace that comes with finding yourself completely alone in the wilderness. I set up my camp kitchen outside the van and got a small fire going, enjoying the last warmth of the day. The autumn air was crisp, but not uncomfortably cold, carrying the sweet scent of pine needles and wild mint. As darkness fell, I heard wolves howling in the distance, a haunting reminder that I was far from civilization. As I sat by my fire, enjoying a glass of wine, I heard the distant sound of an engine. Immediately, anxiety crept in. In 3 months of remote camping, this was the first time I'd encountered another vehicle this far off the main roads. The sound grew louder, and my heart started racing. This was a dead-end road. Whoever was coming would have to stop here. I still find it amazing how quickly anxiety can transform your thoughts. My mind began creating scenarios of a lonely stranger with malicious intent. The peaceful solitude I'd been enjoying suddenly felt dangerous and exposed. I could now see headlights through the trees, getting closer. To my horror, the vehicle pulled up right next to my van. Through the firelight, I could make out an old pickup truck, its paint dulled by years of use. I grabbed my axe and crouched behind the dark side of my van, away from the fire, hoping whoever it was would choose a spot further along the lake. The truck's door opened, and I heard footsteps on the gravel. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might be audible. I had pepper spray in the van, but I couldn't reach it without exposing myself. The footsteps seemed to be coming closer to my fire. Making a split-second decision, I opened my van's door and slammed it shut again, trying to sound as authoritative as possible. The effect was immediate. I heard quick footsteps returning to the truck, an engine starting, and the vehicle driving away toward the far end of the lake. I quickly extinguished my fire and locked myself in the van. The night that followed was one of the most stressful of my life. Every sound had me sitting up, checking the windows. At one point, I was certain I heard footsteps outside, and in my half-asleep state, I had a vivid nightmare of dirty hands reaching through my window, clutching at my pillow. I woke up drenched in sweat, the early morning light filtering through the trees. I didn't even wait for full daylight. I started the van and left as soon as I could see well enough to drive. To this day, I don't know who pulled up next to me that night. Maybe they were just another camper who got spooked by my presence, just as I was spooked by theirs. The incident taught me some valuable lessons about solo camping. While I still travel alone, I'm much more careful about sharing my location with friends and family. I've also learned to trust my instincts. That immediate sense of unease when the truck approached wasn't just paranoia. It was my subconscious recognizing a potentially dangerous situation. Looking back, what strikes me most is how quickly a peaceful scene can transform into something threatening. One minute I was enjoying the serenity of a mountain lake. The next I was hiding behind my van, clutching an axe. The wilderness has a way of reminding us that we're vulnerable out there. And sometimes the greatest threats aren't from wildlife or weather, but from other humans seeking out these isolated places. I've returned to many spots in the Canadian Rockies since then, but I've never gone back to Emerald Lake. Some places, no matter how beautiful, carry memories that are better left undisturbed. The mountains hold countless perfect camping spots. There's no need to revisit one that still gives me nightmares. During my years exploring Montana's wilderness, I've encountered plenty of wildlife. But what happened one autumn morning in Glacier National Park still leaves me questioning my sanity. As an experienced wildlife photographer, I thought I knew how to handle animal encounters. This experience proved me very wrong. I was solo camping at the edge of a remote meadow, my tent strategically placed to catch the early morning light. The location was perfect, a natural clearing, surrounded by aspen trees, whose leaves had turned brilliant gold. Being 12 miles from the nearest trailhead meant I had the place to myself, or so I thought. The trouble began around 4 in the morning. I woke to an unusual sound, the heavy footfalls of what I assumed was a moose. Through the pre-dawn darkness, I could make out massive shapes moving through the meadow. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I was watching an entire herd of elk, at least 20 animals, including several large bulls. Now, elk aren't usually cause for concern. They're typically cautious animals that avoid human contact. But something about these elk was different. Their behavior seemed orchestrated, almost ritualistic. They moved in perfect synchronization, creating a circle around my campsite. The largest bull, standing easily 6 feet at the shoulder, with antlers spreading wider than I am tall, stopped directly in front of my tent. In the growing light, I could see its eyes. There was an intelligence there that seemed far too human. It maintained eye contact with me through the mesh of my tent, never blinking, never moving. The rest of the herd continued their circular movement, their hooves making a rhythmic pattern in the frost-covered grass. The sound was hypnotic thump, 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 like a primitive drum beat. The bull remained motionless, staring, while his herd circled my tent with mechanical precision. I've filmed wildlife for over a decade, but I'd never seen anything like this. Elk are social animals, yes, but this level of coordination was unnatural. They moved like a single organism, each step perfectly timed with the others. The morning mist swirled around their legs, adding to the dreamlike quality of the scene. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the bull suddenly tilted its head back and let out a bugle. But not the typical elk call I'd heard hundreds of times before. This sound was different, almost like words in a language I couldn't quite understand. The entire herd stopped moving simultaneously, as if frozen in time. Then, with no warning, the bull charged. Not at my tent, but at the ground in front of it, stopping just short of impact. The force of its hooves striking the earth sent vibrations through the ground that I could feel through my sleeping pad. It repeated this display 3 times, each strike more forceful than the last. The rest of the herd remained perfectly still, creating a wall of bodies around my campsite. The bull continued its strange behavior, alternating between intense stares and ground strikes, while making that otherworldly bugling sound. I remained motionless, barely breathing, knowing I was witnessing something I wasn't meant to see. As suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The bull raised its head one final time, made a sound that could have been either a bugle or a word, and the entire herd moved away in perfect formation. They disappeared into the forest with impossible silence, leaving no trace of their presence except for the disturbed earth where the bull had struck. When I finally gathered the courage to emerge from my tent, I found the meadow empty. The morning sun revealed a perfect circle of hoof prints around my campsite, but where the bull had performed its display, there was nothing, no marks, no disturbed grass, just untouched frost as if nothing had happened. I packed up quickly and hiked out, my hands shaking as I dismantled my camp. At the ranger station, I tried to describe what I'd seen, but the words felt inadequate. The ranger listened patiently before sharing something that made my blood run cold. Native American legends spoke of spirit elk in these mountains, animals that weren't quite animals, that would appear to humans in times of great change. What I witnessed that morning defied rational explanation. These weren't normal elk behaving normally. The precision of their movement, the intelligence in the bull's eyes, the strange vocalizations, it all suggested something beyond natural behavior. The incident fundamentally changed how I view wildlife and reminded me that there are things in nature we can't explain. I still do wildlife photography, but I've never returned to that particular meadow. Sometimes, when I'm reviewing my photos from other locations, I find myself looking extra carefully at the eyes of the elk I photograph, wondering if I'll see that same unsettling intelligence I encountered that autumn morning. So far, I haven't, and honestly, I hope I never do again. Let this be a warning to anyone considering moving in with a stranger. What started as a simple roommate arrangement in downtown Seattle turned into psychological warfare that still haunts me years later. I'm sharing this story hoping others can learn from my experience. I found the apartment listing online, a luxury high-rise with stunning city views. The rent was surprisingly reasonable for the location, split between 2 roommates. The current tenant, Michael, seemed perfect during our initial meeting. Professional, well-spoken, and apparently successful in the tech industry. His references checked out, and everything appeared legitimate. The first few days were normal. The apartment was beautiful, with floor-to-ceiling windows and modern amenities. But things began changing after I declined Michael's increasingly obvious romantic advances. What followed was a calculated campaign of psychological torture that I still struggle to fully describe. It started subtly. Every morning, precisely at 6 a.m., he would bang on the wall separating our bedrooms, jolting me awake. Late at night, he'd do the same thing just as I was falling asleep. Then came the window tapping. He'd throw small pebbles at my bedroom window at random hours, creating an environment of constant tension. He began monitoring my every move. If I left anything unattended for even a moment, it would disappear. My keys, wallet, phone, only to reappear hours later when it was too late to make whatever plans I'd had. He'd interrogate me about any packages or mail I received. What did you order? I need to know. His tone suggested ownership rather than curiosity. The psychological games escalated. He'd stand directly behind me whenever I left my room, following so close I could feel his presence. If I was cooking or eating, he'd watch intently, making subtle criticisms about my body, my habits, my voice, anything he thought might make me uncomfortable. I developed eating disorders because of his constant scrutiny and mockery. The invasion of privacy became extreme. I discovered he'd been picking the lock to my bedroom while I was out. Things would be slightly moved or missing when I returned. I started barricading my door with furniture at night and leaning my body against it while I slept. The vandalism of my personal items was particularly disturbing. He would contaminate my toiletries, skincare products, and even food. He used my debit cards without permission and somehow managed to order dozens of items through my Amazon account. The purchases were bizarre, expensive Christmas ornaments with possessive messages like, "I'll always watch over you," and other stalker-like items. If I ever showed happiness or excitement about anything, he would immediately begin criticizing and picking apart whatever had brought me joy. His goal seemed to be maintaining a constant state of anxiety and depression. He succeeded. I found myself becoming increasingly withdrawn and paranoid. The financial abuse was significant. Over time, he stole thousands of dollars through unauthorized use of my accounts. He even managed to open new accounts using my personal information. When confronted, he would gaslight me, claiming I had agreed to these purchases or that I was being paranoid. The situation became so unbearable that I finally called the police to help me leave. Even though leaving meant becoming temporarily homeless, I had no family or friends to turn to due to a difficult childhood. I felt freer sleeping in a concrete parking garage than I ever did in that luxury apartment. The aftermath continued even after I left. He showed up at an Apple store where I was shopping just one day after my escape. The experience taught me that material comfort means nothing compared to personal safety and peace of mind. I was infinitely happier sleeping on concrete with a rolled-up towel for a pillow than I ever was surrounded by luxury under his psychological terrorism. What makes the experience particularly chilling is how calculated it all was. Each action was precisely designed to maximize psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability. He never did anything that would leave clear evidence of harassment. Yet every day was filled with small torments that accumulated into psychological torture. I later learned that he had a history of similar behavior with previous roommates. His pattern was always the same: appear charming initially, attempt romantic involvement, then begin systematic psychological abuse when rejected. The police were aware of him, but said they couldn't do anything without concrete evidence of criminal behavior. This experience changed how I approach housing situations forever. I learned that thorough background checks aren't enough. Predators can have perfect-looking references and still be monsters behind closed doors. I also learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away, even if it means facing temporary hardship. For anyone reading this who might be in a similar situation, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't wait until the abuse escalates to breaking point. There are resources and people who can help, even if escape means temporarily giving up comfort and stability. Living in a remote Oregon farmhouse has its charms, but what happened last winter made me seriously question my choice of residence. My family has owned this historic property since the 1930s. A sprawling white farmhouse surrounded by fields of wheat, with the closest neighbor nearly 2 miles away. The incident occurred during my night shift at the local hospital, where I work as an emergency room nurse. My younger sister, Emily, was staying with me at the time, and like any typical evening, we got into an argument before I left for work. She and my 10-year-old daughter decided to cool off by going into town for groceries. About an hour after I arrived at my shift, I went to the break room to make some tea. Standing at the counter, I felt an inexplicable wave of unease wash over me. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. The feeling was so intense that I stopped what I was doing and just stood there, trying to process it. That's when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. I turned, half expecting to see one of my coworkers, but instead found myself facing a tall man wearing what looked like a thick winter coat, his hood pulled up despite being indoors. He stood perfectly still, staring at me with an unsettling intensity. Before I could react, he asked in a monotone voice, "Are you alone?" When I didn't respond, he continued staring, his face obscured by shadows from his hood. Every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong about this encounter. The break room suddenly felt much colder than it should have been. I managed to move past him and out into the hallway, my heart racing. When I glanced back, he was gone. I immediately asked my colleagues if they'd seen anyone matching his description, but no one had noticed any strangers in the building. Security did a sweep but found nothing. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of anxiety. When I finally got home around 3 a.m., I found the house eerily quiet. Calling out for Emily, and my daughter received no response. Their car wasn't in the driveway, which was unusual. They should have been back hours ago. As I approached the front door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I knew Emily would never leave it unlocked, let alone open. Inside, the house was dark and silent, but something felt off. The air smelled different, almost metallic, and there was a heaviness to the silence that made my skin crawl. I moved through the rooms, calling out again, hoping they had simply fallen asleep somewhere. When I reached the kitchen, I found Emily's phone on the counter, next to an open container of groceries. They had made it home, but where were they now? Then I heard footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. Not the normal creaks of an old house settling, but the unmistakable sound of someone walking across the wooden floorboards. I froze, listening, as the steps moved toward the staircase. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. In the darkness, I could make out a figure, the same man from the hospital, still wearing his winter coat. He stood there silently, staring down at me. Then in that same emotionless voice, he said, "They're not here anymore." Pure terror gripped me. I ran for the front door, my only thought being to get help. As I reached my car, I heard him call out from the doorway, "You'll find them at the bridge." Then he simply walked away into the darkness, disappearing between the rows of wheat. I drove straight to the nearest police station, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. As I pulled into the parking lot, my phone finally rang. It was Emily. She and my daughter were safe at a friend's house. They'd had car trouble on their way back from town and couldn't get cell service to call me. The police searched the house, but found no evidence of intrusion. The security cameras at the hospital showed no sign of the mysterious man in the break room. If it weren't for the open front door and the groceries left on the counter. I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Weeks later, I learned that a patient had died in our emergency room 30 years ago. A man who had been found hypothermic, wearing a thick winter coat, near the same bridge where the stranger had said I would find my family. The official report stated he had been wandering the area for days, asking people if they were alone. We still live in the farmhouse, but I've installed every security measure imaginable. Emily and my daughter never saw anything that night, but sometimes, on particularly cold evenings, we catch a glimpse of something moving through the wheat fields, a dark figure in a winter coat, still searching, still asking if anyone is alone. Some experiences change you forever. For me, it was 3 days alone in Wyoming's Wind River Range during an advanced wilderness survival course. I was 20 years old, full of confidence, and about to learn just how quickly the wilderness can turn a routine training exercise into a fight for survival. The course culminated in a solo experience. 3 days and 3 nights alone in the backcountry. The rules were strict. We could bring a backpack, empty canteen, sleeping bag, knife, 6 matches, 50 feet of rope, a plastic tarp, 1 change of clothes, water purification tablets, and a small cooking pot. No food, no water, no GPS. We had to rely on our training in foraging and navigation. The morning of the drop-off, our instructor placed bright orange flags on trees near our starting points, so we could be located if something went wrong. I hiked deeper into the wilderness, feeling more excited than nervous. The late June weather was perfect, and the mountain landscape was stunning. I found an ideal campsite near a stream and set about practicing the survival skills we'd learned. The first day went smoothly. I located a water source, successfully identified several edible plants, and even managed to catch a few small fish using a primitive trap. My shelter, though basic, was sturdy enough to keep me dry. As night fell, I felt proud of my accomplishments and confident in my abilities. Everything changed on the second day. While searching for a new water source, the stream had become too muddy after overnight rain. I encountered another hiker. This was unusual given how remote the location was. But what really set off alarm bells was his appearance and behavior. He was wearing casual clothes, jeans, and a light jacket, completely inappropriate for the terrain. More concerning was his demeanor. He approached me with an unnatural eagerness, asking questions about what I was doing there. When I explained it was part of a survival course, his eyes lit up with an intensity that made me deeply uncomfortable. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. I made an excuse about needing to check my shelter and started walking away. He followed, maintaining the same distance between us, asking increasingly personal questions. "Are you alone out here? Does anyone know exactly where you are?" His voice had a strange, almost mechanical quality. I quickened my pace, but he matched it. The situation was becoming more threatening with each step. Then I remembered what our instructor had said during training. If you ever feel unsafe, head to your flag. The orange marker would lead rescuers to me if needed. And more importantly, it meant I was closer to civilization. But as I changed direction toward my starting point, the stranger's behavior became more aggressive. He began closing the distance between us, his questions turning into statements. You shouldn't be out here alone. No one would hear you scream. My heart was pounding as I broke into a run. I could hear him pursuing me, his footsteps getting closer. The terrain was rough, and I knew one wrong step could mean a broken ankle. But fear drove me forward, crashing through underbrush and scrambling over rocks. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I spotted something that made my blood run cold, another orange flag, but not mine. This was a different flag, weather-beaten and faded, clearly left from a previous course. I had been running in the wrong direction. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but my training kicked in. I forced myself to stop, hide, and think. The sound of pursuit had faded, but I could hear him calling out in that eerily calm voice, searching for me. I stayed absolutely still, controlling my breathing despite my racing heart. As the sun began to set, I heard something that restored hope, the distant sound of a helicopter. The course instructors must have realized something was wrong when I didn't check in at my flag. I broke cover and ran toward the sound, using my emergency whistle to signal my location. The helicopter spotted me just before dark. When I told the rescue team about the stranger, they immediately notified law enforcement. It turned out I wasn't the first person to encounter him. 2 weeks earlier, another survival school student had gone missing from the same area. They found her 3 days later, severely dehydrated but alive, having hidden in a cave to escape the same man. The authorities never caught him. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the next survival student to stray too far from their flag. The experience taught me that survival isn't just about knowing how to find food and water. It's about recognizing when the biggest threat isn't the wilderness itself, but the predators who use its isolation to their advantage. I still teach wilderness survival courses now, but with an added emphasis on situational awareness and trusting your instincts. Nature can be dangerous, but at least it follows predictable patterns. Humans who choose to prey on others in the wilderness are a different kind of threat entirely, one that no amount of survival training can fully prepare you for. My mother worked as a head nurse at an exclusive wellness retreat nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. The facility sat on 800 acres of pristine wilderness, where wealthy clients would spend weeks reconnecting with nature at prices that could buy a small car. What made this place particularly intriguing were the persistent rumors about occult activity in the surrounding woods. While I can't confirm those stories, what happened to me there still sends chills down my spine. I was 12 at the time, living with my mother in a small house perched atop a hill overlooking the retreat. Our nearest neighbor was the facility's groundskeeper, whose cottage sat about a quarter-mile away. Every night, my mother would drive her SUV down the winding gravel road to work the night shift at the retreat. The sound of crunching gravel marking her departures and returns. Earlier that week, she had lost her main set of keys and was using her spare. This detail becomes important later. On this particular night, I was in my bedroom playing video games when I experienced something I still struggle to explain. Without warning, I felt an overwhelming mental compulsion to turn off everything my game, all the lights, and lie facing the wall, pretending to be asleep. My heart started racing for no apparent reason. Within 5 minutes of following this inexplicable urge, I heard our front door open. This was strange because I hadn't heard the distinctive sound of my mother's car on the gravel road. Through the darkness, I heard heavy footsteps moving through our small living room, the wooden floors creaking under deliberate weight. The footsteps continued into the kitchen, which was directly connected to my bedroom. Whoever it was turned on the kitchen light, and I could feel their presence at my doorway, watching me. I remained absolutely still, fighting the urge to turn around, while this unknown person stood there for what felt like an eternity. Finally, they slowly walked out of our house and left. I waited at least 20 minutes before moving, terrified they might still be outside. When I finally called my mother to see if she had come home early, she confirmed she hadn't left the retreat. We changed all the locks the next day and added security bars to the doors. Looking back, there were so many unexplained events during our time living at that place. Items would disappear and reappear in different locations. Strange sounds would echo through the woods at night. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the property's history, though they never shared details with outsiders. But nothing was as terrifying as that night lying there, knowing someone was in our house, watching me sleep. The scariest part wasn't just the intrusion. It was that inexplicable warning system in my mind that told me to hide before the danger arrived. It was as if some protective force knew what was coming and helped me avoid a worse fate. Years later, I learned that the wellness retreat had been built on land that once belonged to a religious commune. The original buildings had burned down in the 1920s under mysterious circumstances. Sometimes I wonder if whatever happened back then left something behind, something that still walks those grounds, entering homes and watching people sleep. The experience taught me to trust those inexplicable gut feelings, those sudden urges that seem to come from nowhere. Sometimes our subconscious mind picks up on dangers our conscious mind hasn't yet recognized. Or perhaps, in certain places with dark histories, there are protective forces that watch over those who live there, warning them when other, more malevolent presences approach. Working as a night clerk at a small gas station in rural Idaho might not sound particularly dangerous, but one winter night changed my perspective forever. The station sits along a remote stretch of highway, surrounded by dense pine forest and mountains. During the graveyard shift, it's not uncommon to go hours without seeing another soul. The incident happened around 2 a.m, during a particularly harsh February cold snap. The temperature had dropped well below zero, and a light snow was falling, creating an almost hypnotic effect under the fluorescent lights of the gas station canopy. I was restocking the coffee supplies when I noticed someone walking across the empty parking lot. What immediately struck me as odd was his attire. A plain white t-shirt and jeans, despite the bitter cold. No coat, no gloves, no protection against the freezing temperature. He moved with an unnatural steadiness, neither hurrying to escape the cold nor showing any signs of discomfort. As he got closer, I could see his face more clearly through the store windows. His expression was blank, almost mask-like, and his skin had an unusual pallor that seemed to match his t-shirt. He didn't blink despite the swirling snow, and his gaze remained fixed straight ahead. When he entered the store, the electronic bell chimed, but he didn't react to the sound. He just stood there, perfectly still, about 10 feet from the counter. Water from the melting snow should have been dripping from his clothes, but his white t-shirt remained pristinely dry. The temperature in the store was set to 70 degrees, yet I could see no sign of him warming up, no shivering, no rubbing his arms, no relief at being out of the cold. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond immediately, just kept staring with those unnaturally still eyes. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying a hollow quality that seemed to echo slightly despite the small space. "What time do you close?" The question itself was ordinary enough, but something about how he asked it made my skin crawl. His lips barely moved, and his voice had no inflection, as if the words were being played through a speaker rather than coming from a human throat. "We're open 24 hours, I replied, unconsciously taking a step back from the counter. He remained silent for several long moments before speaking again. "Then you're always here, always alone." It wasn't a question, but a statement. My hand moved slowly toward the panic button under the counter. The security cameras were recording, but the nearest police station was 20 minutes away at best. "Actually, I'm not alone," I lied, trying to sound confident. "My manager is in the back office." A smile spread across his face, but it was wrong, too wide, too rigid, like a facial expression someone had learned from a book rather than genuine emotion. "No one is in the back office," he said, his voice taking on an almost sing-song quality. "No one is coming down the highway. No one would hear you." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts. The stranger took one step forward, then another, his movements mechanical and precise. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered briefly, and in that split second of darkness, I swear his eyes reflected light like a cat's. Just as he reached the counter, headlights swept across the front windows. A semi-truck was pulling into the lot. The stranger's head snapped toward the light with an impossible quickness, his neck turning far beyond what should have been physically possible. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his pace exactly the same as when he'd entered. I watched through the windows as he crossed the parking lot and continued down the highway, his white t-shirt glowing under the street lights until he disappeared into the darkness. The truck driver came in moments later, commenting on the weird guy he'd passed walking along the highway. "Must be crazy to be out in this weather without a coat," he said. I didn't share what I'd witnessed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what had visited the store that night wasn't someone crazy. It wasn't someone at all. Later that week, I heard about a local legend concerning a teenage boy who had frozen to death along that stretch of highway in the 1970s. He had been found wearing only a white t-shirt and jeans, with no explanation of why he had been out in the winter, whether so underdressed. According to the story, he occasionally appears to solitary travelers and late-night workers, always wearing the same clothes, always asking the same questions. I quit the night shift shortly after that incident. Some things you can rationalize away in the light of day, but that encounter left me with a bone-deep certainty that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Sometimes they wear white t-shirts and visit gas stations in the middle of winter nights, perhaps searching for company in their eternal cold. During my road trip through Nevada's remote highways last spring, I witnessed something that made me question everything I thought I knew about classified government operations. This happened on Route 375, better known as the Extraterrestrial Highway, a desolate stretch of road cutting through the desert near several restricted military facilities. Being 15 and fascinated by anything mysterious or paranormal, I was thrilled when my parents agreed to take this route during our family vacation. The highway lived up to its reputation for isolation. Miles of empty desert stretched in every direction, broken only by scattered Joshua trees and distant mountain ranges. We had been driving for about an hour when I noticed a white government-issued SUV in our rearview mirror. It was unusual enough to see any vehicle out here, but what caught my attention were the occupants, two figures in pristine black suits, complete with dark sunglasses and earpieces, looking exactly like something out of a movie about secret government agents. The SUV maintained a consistent distance behind us for several miles. Through the side mirror, I could see both agents sitting perfectly still, their posture unnaturally rigid. Despite the blazing desert sun, they showed no signs of discomfort in their formal attire. Excited by the possibility of witnessing something classified, I raised my hand to wave at them. Neither agent responded or showed any reaction. They remained completely motionless, their faces forward, sunglasses reflecting the harsh desert light. Just as I was about to point them out to my parents, the SUV suddenly turned onto an unmarked dirt road, the kind that doesn't appear on any civilian maps. The vehicle disappeared behind a ridge, leaving only a cloud of dust as evidence it had ever been there. Later that day, at a small diner in Rachel, Nevada, I overheard local residents discussing similar sightings. They spoke in hushed tones about vehicles that appear and disappear, men in black suits who never seem affected by the desert heat, and strange lights in the sky that move in ways that defy conventional physics. The waitress, overhearing my interest, shared her own encounter from the previous month. She described seeing the same type of SUV parked along the highway at midnight, its occupants standing perfectly still beside the vehicle, their faces turned toward the stars. When she passed by again 20 minutes later, the vehicle and the men had vanished, leaving no tire tracks in the soft desert sand. What makes this story particularly intriguing isn't just the mysterious agents or their government vehicle. It's the complete lack of explanation for their presence in such a remote location. The nearest military installation was miles away, and the dirt road they turned onto led nowhere according to official maps. Some locals believe these figures aren't actually government agents, but something else entirely, using the cover of classified operations to move freely through the area. Others suggest they're part of a secret program, monitoring unauthorized attempts to observe restricted airspace. I've returned to Nevada several times since then, always taking the extraterrestrial highway, hoping to catch another glimpse of those mysterious agents. While I haven't seen them again, I often notice unmarked vehicles appearing and disappearing along that stretch of road, their occupants always in black suits, always wearing sunglasses, always moving with that same unnatural precision. The experience left me with more questions than answers. Were they really government agents? If so, what were they monitoring in the middle of nowhere? And why maintain such a conspicuous appearance in an area where they clearly stand out? Perhaps some mysteries are better left unsolved. The desert holds many secrets, and not all of them wear military uniforms or carry official identification. Sometimes the most intriguing aspects of these encounters are the questions they leave behind, the possibilities they suggest about what might really be happening in the vast, empty spaces of the American Southwest. I never considered myself superstitious. Throughout my childhood, I dismissed anything supernatural as having a logical explanation. That mindset changed completely one autumn evening in 1995 at my grandmother's Victorian mansion. My grandmother, Mrs. Rose Winters, lived alone in this enormous three-story house with wraparound porches and towering windows. The kind of place where shadows seemed to dance in every corner, and floorboards whispered secrets with each step. My parents occupied the ground floor apartment, while my siblings and I shared a room on the second floor. Grandmother had the entire third floor to herself, though she would often come down to use our bathroom, probably to check on us when our parents were out. That particular evening, our parents were running late. To pass the time, my 10-year-old sister Lily, 7-year-old brother Michael, and I decided to watch an old Charlie Chaplin film using grandfather's antique projector. The mechanical clicking of the projector mixed with the ticking of the massive grandfather clock in the hallway, creating an oddly comforting rhythm. The autumn wind howled outside, rattling the tall windows, when suddenly our bathroom door creaked open by itself. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to rationalize it as a draft. Seconds later, we heard footsteps crossing the bathroom floor, followed by the distinct sound of the toilet flushing. Then came the sound of the bathroom door opening and closing again. We huddled together on the Victorian sofa, our bodies trembling. The projector light flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness, except for the pale moonlight streaming through the windows. I distinctly remember the grandfather clock striking 9, its deep chimes echoing through the empty house. Later that evening, when our parents finally returned, they found us still huddled together, tears dried on our cheeks. The next morning, my mother took me aside in the breakfast room, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. Her face was solemn as she told me that Grandmother Rose had passed away the previous evening at the hospital. I never mentioned what happened that night, convinced it must have been my imagination. But 28 years later, during a family gathering at my sister's house in Maine, we finally discussed it. As we sat around the fireplace, Lily described hearing the same sequence of events: the footsteps, the flush, the doors. Michael, too, remembered every detail exactly as I did. Most surprisingly, my mother then revealed that Grandmother Rose had indeed used to check on us through the bathroom every night when our parents were out. Even more chilling, she passed away at exactly 9 o'clock, the precise moment the grandfather clock had chimed that night. Even now, as a grown woman with my own family, that experience remains my only true brush with the unexplainable. It seems Grandmother Rose was determined to check on us one final time, making sure we were safe before she departed this world forever. The mountain winds were particularly fierce that January night, howling through the ancient pines surrounding our cottage. The temperature had plummeted to 25 below zero, and frost patterns spread across our windows like delicate spider webs. Our 3-year-old daughter Emma had fallen asleep on the living room couch while we were watching an old movie, her favorite stuffed penguin tucked safely under her arm. My husband Jack and I decided to let her sleep there while we finished our film. After it ended, I headed upstairs to prepare our bedroom, while he went to the kitchen to fill his water bottle. The moment I laid my head down on the pillow, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a scream unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. The sound echoed through our 140-year-old mountain cottage with such otherworldly intensity that I found myself paralyzed with fear. Almost simultaneously, both Jack and I texted each other asking if we'd heard it too. The scream had come from our living room, where Emma was sleeping. Jack immediately rushed to check on her. He found her exactly as we'd left her, peaceful and undisturbed, mouth slightly open in deep slumber. There was no way that sound could have come from our little girl. We tried to make sense of it. Our cottage sat at the edge of Mountain Hollow Village, population 300, with an old cemetery dating back to the 1800s, just across the narrow road. When we bought the place 6 months ago, locals had warned us about strange occurrences in the area. They spoke of children who had vanished without a trace during the harsh winters of the 19th century, their cries supposedly still echoing through the valley on particularly cold nights. We dismissed these stories as local folklore, despite the occasional shadows we'd glimpse from the corner of our eyes, or the unexplained footsteps we'd hear in the attic. But that scream, it was different. It carried a weight of ancient sorrow, like the collective grief of all those lost souls concentrated into one horrifying sound. I spent that night burning sage in every room, an old practice my grandmother had taught me. Jack stayed up until dawn, watching over Emma. The scream never repeated itself, but something changed in our cottage that night. The atmosphere became heavier, more oppressive, as if whatever had made that sound had left a piece of itself behind. We later learned from our elderly neighbor that our cottage had once been a schoolhouse, where children would seek shelter during fierce mountain storms. Some never made it home. Their parents would come searching, their desperate calls echoing through the valley, much like the scream we heard that night. We still live here, but we never leave Emma alone in the living room anymore. Sometimes, on particularly cold nights, when the wind howls through the pines, we think we can hear faint echoes of that terrible scream, carried on the mountain air like a warning from the past. The sunset came early that November afternoon, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and gray. I was 12, walking home from my violin lesson at Riverbrook School of Arts, my instrument case swinging gently in my right hand. The path through Franklin Park was littered with crimson maple leaves, and a light fog was beginning to settle between the old oak trees. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the park was unusually empty. Most students had left an hour ago, but I'd stayed late to practice for an upcoming recital. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching through the leaves and the distant toll of the school's bell tower. Through the mist, I noticed a young man in a bright red jacket walking behind me. He couldn't have been more than 25. His presence made me uneasy, but I tried to dismiss my concerns. That's when he called out, "Excuse me, do you know if there's a shortcut through this park?" Despite my music teacher's frequent warnings about talking to strangers, I was raised to be polite. Without stopping, I pointed toward a nearby path and kept walking. Looking back, I wish I'd listened to that nagging voice in my head that told me something wasn't right. Suddenly, I felt an explosion of pain at the back of my head. My violin case slipped from my grip as rough hands grabbed my shoulders, dragging me toward a cluster of bushes. Through my dizziness, I realized he had punched me. My legs went weak, but somehow I remained conscious. He pushed me against a tree, his breath smelling of cigarettes. "Just close your eyes," he whispered, pulling my head back. I could see his other hand reaching for a rock on the ground. In that moment, pure survival instinct took over. I threw my hands up just as he tried to slam my head against the tree trunk. The impact shuddered through my arms, but they had absorbed most of the blow. Frustrated, he glanced toward the more secluded area of the park. That's when we both heard it, the sound of keys jingling and heavy boots on the path. "Everything all right over there?" called out Mr. Harris, the school's security guard, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog. The man in the red jacket immediately released me and walked away quickly, trying to appear casual. Mr. Harris must have noticed something was wrong because he rushed over, his radio already in hand. I was shaking uncontrollably, but managed to point in the direction my attacker had gone. Within minutes, police sirens filled the air. Later that evening, as I sat in the police station with my parents, an officer told us they had caught him trying to attack another student near a different school. It turned out he had been released from prison just 2 weeks earlier for similar attempts. My violin was cracked from the fall, but I was alive. Now, whenever I watch my own daughter practice her violin, I make sure she never walks home alone through the park. Some lessons are learned the hard way, but I'm grateful I was able to learn mine without paying the ultimate price. The first snowflakes of the season were drifting lazily through the crisp mountain air when everything started to go wrong. I was deep in the Colorado Rockies, trying to capture the perfect shot of mountain goats for National Geographic. As a wildlife photographer, I was used to challenging conditions, but this day would test my survival skills in ways I never expected. The trouble began when I brushed against some mountain laurel while setting up my tripod. Within minutes, my throat started to tighten. I'd never had an allergic reaction to any plants before, but the burning sensation spreading across my skin told me this was serious. I fumbled for the Benadryl in my camera bag, but the antihistamine seemed barely effective against whatever was attacking my system. Realizing I needed medical attention, I tried to check my location on my GPS device. The screen flickered weakly before going completely dark. The cold had drained its battery. The gathering dusk and thickening snow weren't helping either. The trail I'd followed up had disappeared under a white blanket, and the fog was rolling in fast between the peaks. My breathing was becoming increasingly labored. The camera equipment felt like lead weights as I stumbled through the snow, trying to find my way back down the mountain. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and my throat was nearly swollen shut. That's when I heard it, the distinct sound of bells tinkling through the mountain air. Through the swirling snow, I saw a massive golden eagle land on a dead tree, about 30 feet away. The sound came from a red ribbon tide around one of its legs, with what looked like small silver bells attached. The bird's presence was surreal. Golden eagles rarely approach humans this closely. The eagle took flight again, but instead of disappearing into the gathering darkness, it circled overhead, those tiny bells creating an almost mystical sound in the winter silence. Something told me to follow it. At this point, with my condition worsening and no clear path visible, I had little choice. The majestic bird led me through the mountains, flying from tree to tree, waiting when I fell behind. Whenever I strayed from what must have been the right path, it would screech loudly, drawing me back on course. Through my increasingly fuzzy consciousness, I noticed we were steadily descending. Just as my legs were about to give out, I saw lights through the trees. The eagle had led me straight to a ranger station. The last thing I remember before collapsing was the sound of those silver bells and beating wings. I woke up in the local hospital. The rangers told me they found me just in time, another 30 minutes in those conditions, with that severe allergic reaction, and I might not have made it. When I asked about the eagle with the red ribbon, they looked confused. No tagged eagles had been reported in the area. A week later, while recovering, I visited the local wildlife rehabilitation center. The director listened to my story with growing interest. She showed me a photograph from 20 years ago. An eagle they had rehabilitated and released, marked with a red ribbon and bells so they could track its progress. The bird had disappeared shortly after release, never to be seen again. How did that eagle find me? Why did it choose to help? I've spent my career documenting wildlife behavior, but nothing in my experience can explain what happened that day. Sometimes I still hear those silver bells in my dreams, reminding me that there are things in nature we may never fully understand. October painted the riverside trees in brilliant gold and crimson, but I barely noticed the beauty that evening. I was 19, angry, and walking away from another pointless argument with my boyfriend about my art studies. The old iron railway bridge had always been my refuge when I needed to clear my head and sketch. The bridge stretched across River Mills like a rusty skeleton, abandoned tracks glinting dully in the early evening light. A light breeze stirred fallen leaves across the weathered planks as I made my way to the middle, where I often sat to draw the sunset reflecting off the water below. At 7 in the evening, the bridge was usually deserted. The nearest building was the old station house, now just a hollow shell of brick and broken windows. The shipyard workers typically finished their shifts at 6, leaving this part of town eerily quiet. I had just opened my sketchbook when I heard heavy footsteps on the wooden planks. 2 men were walking onto the bridge, carrying plastic bags that clinked with each step. They wore work boots and heavy jackets, probably shipyard workers who'd stayed late. Something about their presence made my skin crawl. Before I could gather my things, one of them was behind me, his hands suddenly gripping my waist. The touch was wrong, possessive, threatening. The delusion that it might be my boyfriend coming to apologize evaporated instantly when I caught the strong smell of alcohol and cigarettes. The man spoke to his friend in what sounded like Russian or Ukrainian, both laughing as they held me there. The one who wasn't holding me moved closer, speaking broken English. "Pretty girl, why alone here? Maybe want company?" My legs trembled as they asked my name, my age, where I lived. Through my rising panic, I remembered something my self-defense instructor had said: sometimes talking is your best weapon. I forced myself to respond calmly, telling them I was only 16. My father was expecting me. He would come looking soon. I felt the man's grip loosen slightly at the mention of my supposed age. Taking advantage of his hesitation, I twisted away and ran. My sketchbook fell, pages of artwork scattering in the wind, but I didn't stop. My feet pounded against the old planks as I sprinted toward the opposite end of the bridge. I didn't slow down until I reached the busy street near the art college. There, on a bench beneath a streetlight, I finally broke down. A female student found me and called my boyfriend, who came immediately. This time, there was no argument about art school. He just held me while I shook. Looking back now, I realize how lucky I was. Those men could have easily overpowered me, thrown me into the river, and no one would have heard a thing. The police later told me there had been other reports of harassment near the bridge, always involving shipyard workers who stayed late drinking. I never went back to that bridge, never finished the sunset sketch that had scattered across its weathered boards. Sometimes I still dream about it, the sound of clinking bottles, the iron rust smell of the old rails, the feeling of those hands. The next semester, I took evening self-defense classes instead of sunset sketching. Some places, no matter how beautiful, aren't worth the risk of visiting alone. The summer heat lingered heavy in the air that August night, even as darkness settled over our small fishing town. I was 9 years old, playing at my friend's house 3 doors down from our family's weathered blue cottage near the harbor. My 13-year-old brother Peter was supposed to walk me home when it got dark. The salty breeze carried the usual sounds of our coastal town: waves lapping against the docks, seagulls making their final calls, and the distant foghorn from the lighthouse. These familiar sounds suddenly seemed ominous when Peter and I noticed someone following us on our short walk home. The stranger moved oddly, his gait uneven as he emerged from between the stacked lobster traps. Even in the dim light cast by the street lamps, something about his face seemed wrong. His neck was bent at an unnatural angle, and his mouth, it hung open impossibly wide, like a broken hinge. Peter shoved me between 2 fishing boats propped up for repairs, whispering urgently that we should hide. Through gaps in the wooden planks, I watched the man shuffle closer. His face became clearer under the harbor lights, deeply scarred, with a jaw that seemed to have been shattered and never properly healed. What looked like old fishing nets were tangled in his salt-crusted hair. The man paused near our hiding spot, his head swaying slightly as if moving with invisible waves. A low, gurgling sound came from his throat, like water trying to escape a blocked pipe. Then he did something that still haunts my dreams. He began to laugh. It wasn't a normal laugh, but a wet, choking sound that seemed to bubble up from his lungs. My brother held me tightly as the stranger's shadow fell across our hiding place. Just then, we heard the rumble of a truck engine. Old Joe, who ran the bait shop, was driving past in his delivery truck. The man quickly disappeared behind the harbor master's office. We ran home and told our parents, who called the police. The officers searched the harbor, but found nothing except some wet footprints leading to the water's edge. We later learned that similar sightings had been reported over the years, always in late summer, always near the harbor. Months later, my father showed us an old newspaper article from 1967. It detailed a fishing accident where a worker's face was crushed in a winch malfunction. The man survived, but was never quite right afterward, sometimes wandering the docks at night, scaring local children. He disappeared during a storm in 1972. His body never found. The following summer, my parents moved us to their lake house, away from the coast. But every August, when the air gets thick with heat and humidity, I think about that night. Sometimes I wonder if what we saw was really the disfigured fisherman, or something else. Something that had always lived in those dark waters, wearing the shape of a tragedy everyone remembered. 2 decades later, I still can't bring myself to visit that harbor after sunset. Peter became a marine biologist, seemingly unaffected by that night, but he never takes night dives. When I asked him recently if he remembered that encounter, he just shook his head and said some things are better left in the past, like old shipwrecks resting on the seafloor. The last time I visited our old town, I drove past the harbor at dusk. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing among the lobster traps, face turned toward the setting sun, mouth open as if trying to catch the last rays of light. I didn't stop to look closer. Some mysteries of the sea should remain unsolved. November rain drummed steadily against the tall windows of my Victorian apartment, creating an oddly peaceful backdrop as I worked on my latest novel. The old house, built in 1883, had been converted into separate units 5 years ago, retaining much of its original charm, including the magnificent Steinway grand piano in my living room. As a writer, I'd fallen in love with the apartment's atmosphere the moment I saw it. The real estate agent mentioned it had once been a prestigious music school, which explained the ornate ceiling medallions and the surprisingly good acoustics. The piano came with the apartment. The owner insisted it shouldn't be moved, as it had been there for over 7 decades. That rainy November evening, I was alone in the building. The couple above me was on vacation, and the elderly woman below had gone to stay with her daughter. The sound of my typing mixed with the patter of rain, and the occasional creaking of old floorboards, sounds I'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 months. Around 8 o'clock, I heard the first notes. They were soft, barely audible above the rain. A few hesitant keys of what sounded like the beginning of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. I froze at my desk, fingers hovering above my keyboard. The piano was clearly being played, but I was absolutely alone in the apartment. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was just the rain or the old building settling. But then came another series of notes, more confident this time. The melody floated through the room like a memory, trying to reconstruct itself. My desk lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wall. Gathering my courage, I stepped into the living room. The piano sat silently in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the street lights from outside. As I watched, the keys began to move by themselves, creating a haunting rendition of the Nocturne. The playing was beautiful but imperfect, like someone practicing, trying to get it right. I stood transfixed as the invisible pianist continued their practice. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. and I could see my breath in the air. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the music stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. That night I couldn't sleep. I researched the building's history and discovered that in 1952, a young piano student named Margaret Winters had died here. She had been practicing for her conservatory audition, determined to perfect Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. According to the article, she was found at the piano, sheet music still open to that same piece. Over the following weeks, I heard the piano several more times, always when I was alone, always the same nocturne. Each time, the playing was slightly different, as if Margaret was still trying to perfect her performance. Sometimes the music would stop abruptly, followed by what sounded like frustrated sighs. I began leaving the sheet music open on the piano, and sometimes in the morning, I'd find the pages turned. Once I even left a note. "It sounds beautiful, Margaret." The next morning, I found the note had been moved to the piano bench, and that night, for the first time, she played the nocturne all the way through flawlessly. The music hasn't stopped entirely, but it's different now. Instead of frustrated practice sessions, I occasionally hear complete pieces played with confident expertise. Sometimes, when I'm struggling with writer's block, a gentle melody will drift through the apartment, as if offering encouragement. I've never told my landlord or the other tenants about my ghostly pianist. Some might find it terrifying, but to me, it's oddly comforting. We're both artists, after all, pursuing our passions in this old Victorian house. One in the world of words, the other in the realm of eternal music. The brass bell above the shop door chimed softly as we entered Greenwood's Antiques, a sound almost lost among the synchronized ticking of countless clocks. It was a sweltering August afternoon in Boston's historic district, and I had tagged along with my father, a history professor at the local university, as he searched for research materials. The shop's interior was a maze of time-worn treasures, but what immediately caught my attention were the clocks, hundreds of them covering every wall, their pendulums swinging in mesmerizing patterns. Sunlight filtered through dusty, stained glass windows, casting rainbow shadows across their polished faces. "Mr." Greenwood emerged from behind a towering grandfather clock, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the colored light. He was tall and thin, with long fingers that seemed perfect for manipulating delicate clock mechanisms. When he saw me, his expression changed from polite interest to something I couldn't quite understand. While my father browsed through old manuscripts, Mr. Greenwood approached me. "You remind me of someone," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the collective ticking. "Do you like books?" Without waiting for my answer, he disappeared behind a velvet curtain and returned with a small leather-bound volume. "I've only had boys visiting," he said, showing me the book. "I've been waiting for a little girl to give this to." His manner was intense, almost desperate. "I have a wonderful collection upstairs, books, dolls, even a miniature clockwork carousel. Would you like to see them?" Something in his voice made my skin crawl. I remembered my mother's warnings about strangers, but this was different. There was a sadness in his eyes that seemed both genuine and somehow wrong. When he moved closer, I caught the scent of old brass and machine oil. "I live right above the shop," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper Such lovely things up there. They used to belong to my daughter. You're just about her age." He reached out as if to touch my hair, and I instinctively stepped back. My father, thankfully, chose that moment to return. "Mr. Greenwood straightened up immediately, his demeanor shifting back to that of a proper shopkeeper. But as we were leaving, I heard him murmur, "She would have been 42 this year." That evening, my father received a phone call from a colleague who had heard about our visit to Greenwoods. The story he shared chilled me to the bone. 30 years ago, Mr. Greenwood's 11-year-old daughter had vanished from the shop. She had been helping him repair clocks after school, learning the family trade. One day, while he was working in the basement, she disappeared. The only trace was her pocket watch, found on the shop floor, its hands frozen at 3:17. The police investigation revealed a pattern over the years. Several young girls had reported uncomfortable encounters at the shop. But with no evidence of wrongdoing, the cases were eventually closed. Mr. Greenwood continued his business, surrounded by his clocks and his memories, perhaps genuine grief, perhaps something darker. The next week, my father told me the shop was closed. Mr. Greenwood had suffered a heart attack and passed away in his sleep. When the police searched the upstairs apartment, they found a room filled with children's books, antique dolls, and a beautiful clockwork carousel, all preserved as if waiting for a little girl who would never return. But what haunted me most was what they found in his diary. The final entry read, "Time moves differently for me now. In this shop, it's always 3:17, and she's still here, helping me with the clocks. Today, I saw her again, in a young visitor's face. Perhaps next time she'll stay. I never went back to that part of Boston. Sometimes, though, when I hear multiple clocks ticking together, I remember that afternoon, the rainbow light, the desperate look in Mr. Greenwood's eyes, and the story of a little girl forever frozen at 3:17 in her father's broken timeline." The old clock tower still dominated the converted factory building, its massive face glowing against the December sky. Below it, my loft apartment occupied what used to be the master clockmaker's workshop. As a watch restorer myself, I found a peculiar comfort in living surrounded by the ghostly echoes of timepieces past. It started 3 weeks after I moved in. Every night, precisely at 10:47, someone would knock on my door. Not the casual knock of a neighbor, but 3 distinct, measured taps, like a clockmaker testing the resonance of a case. The first time it happened, I was working on restoring a 19th century pocket watch. The knocking startled me so much, I nearly dropped the delicate mechanism. When I opened the door, the dimly lit hallway was empty, its wooden floors creaking softly as they settled. Initially, I dismissed it as old building sounds, but the pattern was too precise. Every night, my wall clock would tick toward 10:47, and without fail, those 3 knocks would follow. I started documenting each occurrence, marking them in my restoration logbook. The building's history offered no immediate explanation. The clock factory had operated from 1878 until 1947, when a tragic accident claimed the lives of 3 workers. According to Mrs. Peterson, my elderly neighbor who had lived here since the building's conversion, the accident occurred at 10:47 p.m. when the main gear mechanism in the tower malfunctioned. The old tower clock still keeps perfect time, she told me one afternoon over tea. Hasn't been wound in decades, but it never stops. Some say it's because the souls of those workers are still here, keeping the gears turning. I wasn't superstitious, but the nightly visits were beginning to affect my work. My hands would shake as 10:47 approached, making delicate repairs impossible. I installed a security camera, but it would mysteriously lose power each night just before the knocking began. One evening, I decided to wait by the door. As the tower clock began to chime 10:47, I pulled it open before the knocks could come. The hallway was empty, but the air felt different, heavier, charged with the scent of machine oil and brass. Then I noticed something odd about the shadows on the wall. They seemed to move against the light, forming shapes that reminded me of the factory's old mechanical diagrams. As I watched, they shifted into what appeared to be three figures, their hands raised as if reaching for my door. The temperature dropped suddenly, and my restored pocket watches began chiming in unison, dozens of them marking time together, though many hadn't worked in years. Through their synchronized chiming, I heard what sounded like distant voices discussing mechanical problems, the echo of metal on metal, the hum of machinery long silent. The next day, I started researching the accident in detail. In the city archives, I found the original incident report. The three workers had been trying to repair the tower's mechanism, attempting to correct a critical timing error. The clock had been running exactly 13 minutes fast. That night, for the first time, I checked the tower clock against my atomic watch. It was running exactly 13 minutes fast, showing 10:47 when it was really 10:34. The same error that had led to the tragedy 75 years ago was still there, preserved in the mechanism like a temporal scar. I'm a clockmaker trained to solve mechanical problems. The next day, I requested permission to examine the tower mechanism. It took weeks of careful work, but I finally corrected the timing error that had haunted the building for 7 decades. That night at 10:34, the true time, I heard the knocks one last time. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty as always, but the air carried the faint scent of machine oil and what sounded like distant voices saying, "Thank you." The knocking never came again. The tower clock now keeps perfect time, and my collection of restored watches runs smoothly. But sometimes, late at night, I still catch the faint echo of mechanical rhythms in the walls, the heartbeat of a building where time itself holds memories that refuse to fade. The old lighthouse creaked and groaned against the autumn storm, its ancient bones protesting each gust of wind. I was 12, tasked with watching over my younger sister and 3 of her friends during their first lighthouse sleepover. Our parents had converted the former keeper's quarters into a cozy home 2 years ago. But tonight, the familiar space felt different. The girls were huddled in the living room, their sleeping bags arranged in a circle as they watched The Little Mermaid on our old projector. The storm outside provided an eerily perfect backdrop, with waves crashing against the rocks below and wind whistling through the tower's weathered joints. Being the oldest at 12, I tried to project confidence, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way the lighthouse's rotating beam cast strange shadows through the windows. or how the spiral staircase seemed to amplify every sound from above. The girls were engrossed in their movie when we first heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the observation deck. Our parents were at a town meeting, and we were supposedly alone. I remembered the story about the last lighthouse keeper, who vanished during a storm similar to this one in 1968. His body was never found, but locals claimed his spirit still tended to the light during dangerous weather. My sister Katie, the bravest of the young ones at 9, suggested we use Dad's telescope to look up at the observation deck. The telescope stood on its tripod near the window, usually used for stargazing on clear nights. With shaking hands, I adjusted it toward the deck above. Through the lens, I saw a dark figure moving around the gallery. The man was wearing what looked like an old-style keeper's uniform, but something about his movements seemed wrong, almost mechanical. He turned toward the telescope, and my blood ran cold. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see that his neck was bent at an impossible angle. Katie and her friends wanted to see too. 2 of them, both 8, took turns at the telescope, while I desperately tried to think of what to do. The 4th girl, 7-year-old Lucy, was already crying. That's when we heard the metal door at the top of the stairs open, followed by heavy footsteps descending the spiral staircase. I hurried the girls into my parents' room, the only one with a solid door lock. Through the door, we could hear the footsteps getting closer, accompanied by a strange dragging sound and the jingle of what might have been keys. Then the lighthouse beam stopped rotating. In the sudden, alternating darkness and light, we heard someone trying the doorknob. A voice, rough like waves over rocks, asked, "Is anyone watching the light?" The girls were crying silently now, and I held them close as we heard the footsteps move away, back up the stairs. Through the window, we saw the beam begin to rotate again, cutting through the storm's darkness. When our parents returned an hour later, they found us still locked in their room. The police searched the lighthouse, but found only wet footprints leading up to the gallery footprints that ended abruptly at the railing. Later, we learned that a fishing boat had been caught in the storm that night. The captain reported that they had lost their bearings in the darkness, but the lighthouse beam had suddenly become brighter and more focused, guiding them to safety. My parents still live in the lighthouse, but they've never left us kids alone there again. The telescope now stays covered at night, and we keep the door to the spiral staircase locked. But during storms, we sometimes hear footsteps above, and the beam always seems to shine a little brighter, as if the old keeper is still performing his duties, protecting sailors from the dangers of the dark sea. When I visit home now, I avoid looking up at the gallery at night. Once, during a particularly fierce storm, I thought I saw someone in a keeper's uniform standing at the railing, head bent at that impossible angle, scanning the horizon. I didn't look again. Some guardians, it seems, never abandon their post, even after death. The Moonlight Ridge Hotel stood like a wooden giant against the winter storm. Its Victorian architecture, a stark silhouette against the snow-laden sky. I'd chosen this remote mountain retreat to finish my novel, attracted by its off-season solitude and history. The elderly concierge, Mr. Wilson, had mentioned I was their only guest that week. Something about the approaching blizzard keeping others away. My room was on the 3rd floor, overlooking the frozen lake. The first strange incident occurred during my second night, when I heard piano music drifting up from the lobby. It was well past midnight, and the melody was hauntingly beautiful. Schubert's Serenade played with delicate precision. When I called the front desk, Mr. Wilson insisted there couldn't be anyone playing. The lobby's grand piano hadn't been touched since 1953, when the hotel's resident singer, Adelaide Morton, had her final performance. Something in his voice made me uneasy. The music continued nightly, always starting at midnight. Sometimes it was accompanied by what sounded like someone singing, a soprano voice that seemed to contain both beauty and despair. I began researching the hotel's history, discovering that Adelaide had suffered from severe mental illness, believing her dead sister was living in her wardrobe, stealing her identity. On my fifth night, exhausted from writing, I fell asleep early only to wake suddenly at midnight. The room was freezing. Instead of piano music, I heard somebody moving inside my wardrobe, the massive oak piece that had been in the room since the hotel's opening in 1920. The doors rattled slightly, and I heard what sounded like ragged breathing. Then a woman's voice, barely a whisper, "Have you seen my baby? She's in here somewhere. She's wearing my face." I couldn't move, couldn't even reach for my phone. The wardrobe doors slowly opened, revealing a woman in an outdated evening gown, her face a mask of desperation. Her skin had an unnatural bluish tint, and her eyes, they seemed to contain all the madness and sorrow in the world. She stepped out, moving with an unsettling grace. "You look like her," she whispered, her voice becoming more distorted. "You have my sister's face. Give it back." The last words came out as an inhuman shriek that shook the windows. I managed to bolt from the room, running down the corridor as her screams echoed behind me. In the lobby, I found Mr. Wilson at his desk, looking unsurprised. "You've met Adelaide," he said quietly. "She was our star performer once. Such a tragedy." He showed me an old photograph from 1953. Adelaide Morton stood by the grand piano, beautiful and poised. Beside her was her identical twin sister, Grace. According to Wilson, Grace had died in a car accident months before the photo was taken. Adelaide had suffered a mental breakdown, convinced her sister was hiding in her wardrobe, stealing her face and voice. On the night of her final performance, after a brilliant but erratic rendition of Schubert's Serenade, Adelaide had locked herself in her room, the same room I'd been staying in. When they finally broke down the door, they found her inside the wardrobe, having apparently suffocated herself while searching for her sister. "She still performs sometimes," Wilson said, glancing at the piano. "And she's still looking for Grace. We've learned to let her be. The music is beautiful, even if the rest." He trailed off as piano notes began drifting through the lobby. I checked out the next morning, but not before hearing Adelaide one last time. As I passed the ballroom, I saw her at the piano, playing Serenade. For a moment she looked up, and I saw not madness but infinite sadness in her eyes. Then she smiled, a heartbreaking expression, and faded away like morning mist. The Moonlight Ridge Hotel still stands, its windows dark except during storms, when they say you can see Adelaide moving from room to room, searching wardrobes for her sister's stolen face. And on perfectly still nights, they say her voice still soars over the mountain, singing Schubert's serenade in endless duet with a sister who exists only in her fractured memory. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.